this time. We normally do emerging trends and challenges, but this time it's specifically on AML and CTF, anti-money laundering and countering the terrorism financing. Day one, we had some brilliant presentations yesterday by Ella Rosenberg of Armada. She is an EU regulatory compliance specialist. We had Mr. Oliver Wilcox from the State Department do a countering violent extremism intervention that he normally does. And we had Mr. Mohammed Omar also presenting yesterday. And there was a lot of information. It was really, really interesting. I learned a few things too myself. So as always, that's the goal, is to try to get as much information to students and to our audience as possible. So with that, because counterterrorism has many layers and a new approach and strategy was needed, we looked at past events within, the global audience. We did a few research projects and studies and realized that the content and curriculum that's out there, the narratives have changed. Terrorism has become a business with even business models, visions, and everything, depending on the location. Still, sometimes people, they see terrorism as just a way of life in many, many cultures and conflict areas. And so with that, we know, as Malala Yousafzai says, that guns kill terrorism, but education kills terrorism. Guns kill terrorism, my apologies. And so with that, we've created a curriculum centered around a new approach, which is online to reach audiences globally. Most people cannot afford the standard traditional university education. I believe 99% of the population at that matter cannot afford to go to college. So we're making it very affordable for our curriculum and programs. We currently have diplomas in criminal justice with investigation and diploma in international security studies. And both of those programs culminate at a graduate level also. And with our collaboration with Paris Graduate School, we've developed a master's degree in international security studies, the MIS program. And the way it works is pretty simple. We have an admissions packet on our website. You download that, you fill it out. We have to go through a vetting process to make sure that the curriculum and content that we're delivering is being given to the correct audience. We don't want terrorists to get our education. That's just that simple. And so the vetting process is pretty stringent. We look through records and we look through documents to make sure that the correct audience is receiving that. So our institute, in a sense, is changing the public debate that's so discourseful and dispassionate right now, to train and educate new leaders. We strive to bring together the best minds to ideate on crucial national and international issues. And when we say that we have brought operational and academia together, it's the first time throughout. Most academia do research projects to inform the public, but academics and operational tend to bring together a different approach, because we can actually go teach the academic portion and the operational portion. And so where most people get that at a higher level through a master's degree or a PhD or senior diplomat level or high officer level, it's the 99% of the population that really need this information. Why? Because most wars are based on deception. And throughout history, if you've never studied warfare, it's based on deception. And so if you give them the truth, people don't really like that sometimes, and they want to hide that. And education is the truth. It just depends on which side of the fence you lie. But if you told people your political preference, you have failed as an educator. You have failed. And I'll tell you that right up front. Nobody needs to know your personal opinions on things. We all have biases. But as an educator, you have a responsibility to teach the truth within academia. And if you add the operational, part there, you're liable to share the best part of both worlds, which many students don't get. They're either used as pawns or influenced in a direction to get people politically elected into a position of power. And so we don't want that. We want to educate the truth. So with that, we have today our International Intern Program Director, Mr. Stuart Ripon-Ness, who will be completing this cohort with projects that his interns have completed. And so at this time, I will introduce Mr. Stuart Ripon-Ness, who is a British military veteran, having served many years with the Royal Military Police for Her Majesty. His service took him to dangerous operations in countries such as Iraq, Bosnia, Kosovo, as well as an undertaking a specialized weapons intelligence investigator role in Northern Ireland. Specialized in foreign weapons and incendiaries, working alongside the Police Service Northern Ireland, military intelligence, and government officials. Following his distinguished service, Stuart returned to study, graduating with first-class honors degree in Middle Eastern Studies and Arabic, with his dissertation focused on Hezbollah and Hamas. Stuart has recently written the Beginner's Arabic Diploma course for our institution, and as some of you know, the Arabic language course is open to enrollment still. Stuart has recently written the Beginner's Arabic Diploma and participated as a guest speaker within the GCTI on more than one occasion. He's been our moderator several times. Stuart also just published a book, Big Arabic Words. And so, and I think he'll showcase that throughout today's session. So with that, I will turn it over to Stuart, who will lay out today's schedule with the presentations, and then midway, we have a special presentation by Dr. Suha Akiki and General Adekunle Olawunmi. Both are PhDs who are also in development with our master's program that we'll deliver with the Paris Graduate School. So at this time, Stuart, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, sir, for that fantastic introduction. Appreciate it. And I like the push on my book. I will show that later on. I have it in front of me. So yes, welcome to the GCTI webinar this evening. Thank you everyone for joining us. It was a fantastic evening yesterday, even in the UK. I know it was the morning in other parts of the world. But we also have a fantastic lineup of speakers tonight. We're going to kick off with Mr. Denny Callum. Now, before I introduce Denny, I want to say that the last 3 months that I have spent with this group of interns has been absolutely phenomenal. I mean, I couldn't with their own key strengths and characteristics to take the first intern program forward for GCTI, which has been a huge success, I personally believe. Our interns have undertook joint articles that they've written. They've done an independent research paper, which they'll be presenting on this evening. And they've also done group work on grant research proposals and operational manuals for GCTI and such like. It's been a super busy 3 months. I've really enjoyed being a part of them, and I hope they've enjoyed being a part of GCTI. And tonight we should tie it all together with these wonderful presentations that they have honestly worked tirelessly at. So I hope you enjoy them. So sit back and enjoy. I am going to introduce Mr. Denny Callum. Mr. Denny was born all the way in the beautiful Croatia. I've been there. It's very beautiful. And it's stunning. Mr. Denny recently graduated from Coventry University right here in the UK in terrorism, international crime and global security. Denny is particularly interested in religious terrorism and radicalization, besides politology and criminology. He's keen in forensic science and criminal investigation as well. Denny's ultimate career goal is to have a PhD in criminology and terrorism, in which he would achieve his dream to become a professor of criminology, and he would love to teach undergrads in this topic area. His second career goal is to work as a criminal intelligence analyst in a counterterrorism unit and become the leader of a crime analyst team. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Mr. Denny to the stage, and the stage is yours, sir. Thank you.
Hello, thank you so much for introduction, Stuart. You've been a wonderful mentor for this month, and I was really happy to present my topic today. Good evening, everyone, and good day, depending on which time zone you are. And I will start with my topics. In the radicalization in prison. Shall I, I will start with radicalization in prison. This is my topic research project that I've been working on this summer, in which I made comparative evaluation of approaches in Saudi Arabia and Singapore. For example, after the 9/11, thousands of arrests of jihadists actually prompted states to devise the de-radicalization program.
Sorry to interrupt you. Can anybody see the screen, or is it just me that can't see the screen?
I cannot see it. That's fine. He'll get there.
I
Try
cannot
again.
either right now.
Yeah, try again.
No worries.
There we go.
Can you see
Share.
it now? This presentation?
Yeah, hit share. You have to click on the window.
Okay.
There you go.
May I start now? So I've been talking about and doing research about the radicalization in prison, in which this topic actually became of interest for terrorism experts, particularly after the 9/11 and London bombings and also terrorist attacks in Saudi Arabia in 2003 as well. In which these de-radicalization programs aim to balance in traditional security efforts. However, Saudi Arabia and Singapore have devised ideological based de-radicalization program, but the main question is why they're not so successful in some country.
Denny,
why is the question? Yes.
I'm so sorry, sir. I don't mean to keep stopping your presentation, but we can't see your screen very well. It's still minimized.
Okay.
So we can't see your PowerPoint very well.
Yeah, he needed to click on the screen where it's showing the box. So that's all. If he does that again, he needs to select the screen in his share screen. That's all. So try again, Denny. And just a second.
Can you see it now?
Not at the moment. It's still black. Don't panic.
Okay, I will try.
There
you go, sir. Okay, we're off.
Can you see it now?
Yeah, try and speak a bit closer to the microphone as well, and you're golden.
Okay. So can you hear me?
Yeah, this is all part of the process. Good job.
Yeah, okay. So I will just continue with my topics. So de-radicalization in prison, which became interest for terrorism experts and researchers after the 9/11, and in which 1,000 arrests happens, especially for those who commit terrorist attacks as an Islamist terrorist. However, the idea back at the time was to actually incarcerate the terrorists in order to prevent a further terrorist attack. So the radicalization program is actually the part of the counterterrorism strategy, in which the main goal is to understand the radicalization process, in which the prison became not only safe haven, but also a focal ground to disseminate their radical ideology, Salafi ideology, Wahhabism, in which they actually network with themselves and exchange their tactics and recruit and radicalize a new member. Also, in order to understand the radicalization, it should be actually set up definition. So radicalization represents a dynamic process whereby an individual increasingly accepts and supports violent extremism. However, the reason could be ideological, political, or personal. For example, also psychological, for example, could lead an individual to be more susceptible to radicalization. For example, just a short comparison in the book, The Dark Trajectory of Jihad by Barker, an FBI agent actually has conducted a semi-interview with a lot of terrorists who actually end up in prison, and he actually investigated the reason behind why they commit terrorist attacks. What is their justification for this kind of atrocity against some grudge against, for example, European citizen, or is there because they don't feel a sense of belongingness, or there is an identity crisis? There is a lot of question from psychological aspect to be actually set out. For example, also for example, many factors such as loneliness, social isolation could also lead to be more susceptible to radicalization in prison. So it is really important that in prison, it is divided between ordinary criminals and criminals who are actually incarcerated because of their terrorist offenses. So in de-radicalization, we have also a disengagement, which is actually pretty different, because behavior, while de-radicalization is actually aimed to address the ideological challenge. It should be actually said that in the radicalization program, especially in Saudi Arabia and Singapore, it's mostly focused on minor terrorist offenders and not on hardcore terrorist offender. Because, for example, if you try to de-radicalize Taliban, who has a really rooted ideology, instill ideology, it is practically impossible to de-radicalize this kind of view. But someone who hasn't been that much influenced by this kind of ideology could be back and reintegrate back into the society. So in radicalization process, the individual who has experienced trauma decision to join the terrorist group. So factors such as in radicalization process, the main distinction between the radicalization is ideologically based, while disengagement is behavior. So the the terrorist once when he's incarcerated, he has this all he has actually the ideological view and the misinterpretation of Islam, but he's actually abstained from doing violence and any kind of atrocity against humanity. Also, in the case of Saudi Arabia, so the Saudi officials actually decided to start with de-radicalization program, particularly after the attack in May 2003. Programs in the kingdom to educate public about radical Islam. So they try to teach them that their version of Islam is actually a good version of Islam, and the central approach to countering radical ideology is actually of prison extremists is the creation of counseling programs, psychological program, and re-education, religious re-education, in which they will teach them what is the correct version of Islam. For example, the most important part is direct financial resources from oil in Saudi Arabia to aftercare program, in which this is the, for example, how this rehab center for jihadists looks like. It's really which in which why in the UK we have so much terrorist recidivism. Research actually suggests that 5% commit another terrorism offense after leaving prison. The perfect example and prime example is Usman Khan, who stabbed 2 people to the Nurul Bridge around a year after being released on license. Because once they've been released, they don't have a purpose. They don't have sense of belonging. So Saudi Arabia, they gave them purpose. They gave them actually money. They gave them they gave them purpose to actually forget those extremist views. So in prison, we have actually the counseling program is based on religious and psychological debates with terrorist sympathizers, in which a counseling process of detained takes place inside and previously shown, it was actually a rehab center. So sessions are conducted on one-on-one basis, and the main objective is to make radical prisoners relinquish their ideological beliefs, to give up on this kind of beliefs, especially the doctrine of tafkir. So the organizational structure of the counseling program is the advisory committee under the Ministry of Interior, comprised of Islamic scholars, academics, psychologists, and others. The advisory committee consists of 4 subcommittees: the religious, which is the largest one, the psychological and social subcommittee, and security subcommittee, and the media subcommittee. Another component of the program is the psychological and social subcommittee, composed of psychologists and psychiatrists responsible for evaluating the emotion, motivation, personality, and behavior and interpersonal relationship of a prisoner. However, it should be, I should say that why psychiatrist is needed here is because of to avoid the manipulation of prisoners. So I think that in this kind of evaluation, psychiatrists are more with medical degree are more successful than psychologists. So in the aftercare programs, we have the multifaceted approach to de-radicalization adopted by Saudi government, which contains several factors that facilitate the disengagement processes that are actually core elements in counterterrorism. So we have jihadists has been, for example, arrested and detained by security services. Then one, upon successful completion, the rehabilitation process, they're actually transferred to external rehabilitation facility, the Care Rehabilitation Center. Once they complete this program successfully, the Saudi government remains involved through the advisory committee and through the prisoner's larger family network, which means that family is actually the critical and crucial to prevent recidivism. The government also maintains rehabilitated prisoners' good behaviors and engage with them in stringent follow-up process that require former detainees to meet periodically with authorities after release. So the government also required of prisoners to settle down, marry, and have children, which gave them actually the purpose. Is actually the most important part in aftercare program. And the unique aspect of the reintegration of this fresh graduate to society is the continuing, actually the continuation of monitoring of their monitoring with strong reference to Saudi culture. Also, I'd like to say that, for example, in the UK, 6 terrorists were convinced for terror offenses after the release, and they reoffend because in the case of UK, they manage their de-radicalization program according to British values and culture, instead to adjust those values to Islam culture. And that is the reason for actually terrorist recidivism in most countries. Oh. So when I was assessing effectiveness of the Saudi de-radicalization program, the program is actually really successful, because according to Saudi government officials, the recidivism rates of released security prisoners are only 1 to 2%, or 35 people of approximately 1,400 prisoners who have been released after participation in the program. So the main reasons of success of if some de-radicalization program is successful is economical, financial, educational, and social incentiveness of some country in order to actually pursue the actual resources to reintegration into mainstream society. So why is the Saudi rehabilitation program is hardly applicable to other countries? There is actually many reasons for that. First is massive oil resources, which enable the kingdom to construct new prison facility for its inmates and to avoid further radicalization. Likewise, actually new facilities have been built to rehabilitate its prisoners and to offer them an environment that is different from the prison and in which they can enjoy a variety of activity. For example, art therapy, sports. So everything that will keep their mind busy and not to think of a radical view. With its program, this method can be incorporated into numerous other country programs and possibly alleviate the growing threat from Muslim extremists. So Saudi Arabia program may have many advantages due to the amount of resources that Saudi is able to dedicate to the program. So in the case, so this was in the case of Saudi Arabia. So in the case of Singapore, Saudi Arabia is Muslim country with 97% of Muslim citizens, while Singapore only has 15%. And also Saudi Arabia is the kingdom in which Sharia law is incorporated into the legislation, which has an influence on criminal and civil cases as well. So in considering other countries that operated Middle Eastern countries, Singapore was identified as a country with an established program that has a minority Muslim population. So it is so the most significant threats from terrorism in Singapore have developed from Islamic radicalization. So Singapore is a republic with a parliamentary system of government consisting of three branches: the executive, legislative, and judicial. Since 9/11, the Internal Security Department has utilized the Internal Security Act to incarcerate Jemaah Islamiyah suspect and other suspected terrorist supporter. So we have actually this similar method in the eradication program in Singapore and in Saudi Arabia. So the organizational structure of the religious rehabilitation group consists of three organizational divisions. The one is the administrative oversight and leadership of the group, which consists of two co-chairmen. And the co-chairmen are actually responsible for program implementation and nominating potential religious rehabilitation group. The largest component of the religious rehabilitation group is the religious counselor. So the focus of religious rehabilitation group is the philosophy of re-educating Islamic extremists in which the counseling group is consisted of Islamic scholars and educated leaders from the Islamic community. The first stage consists of the counselor interviewing the inmates, the same as actually in the radicalization program in Saudi Arabia, in which the inmate in which the purpose is to actually recognize radical ideology and incorrect interpretation of Islamic concepts. And this stage provides the insight into what is the basis or justification for the inmate's action. The second stage is the counselor discredits all radical and extremist view. And this stage of counseling provides the inmate with valid justification why violent extremism must be avoided. And in the third stage, incorrect interpretation of Islamic doctrine or radical ideology are actually replaced by moderate Islamic interpretation. So the core function of Singapore program is also to counter the extremist ideology held by imprisoned terrorists. And Singapore uses moderate Islamic scholar to engage in debate and counseling with the Muslim organization in the community to provide monetary assistance to prisoners' families. And that's why it's also there is no why the de-radicalization program in Singapore is also successful. So effectiveness of Singapore de-radicalization program in prison appears to have been successful in the rehabilitation or de-radicalization of several of its extremist detained. Approximately 60% of the detained have been released from prison, although some of them are under conditional or supervised release. However, it should be, I should say that there is, for example, in Saudi Arabia, we have incarcerated 100 prisoners. In Singapore, we have, for example, 50. So security, they can actually monitor them, and in order to prevent their further planning of terrorist attacks. Another advantage for the Singapore program is the ability of the government to draw on vast invest financial resources to implement program objectives. Unlike Saudi Arabia, Singapore has only a small number of prisoners, prisoner extremists, and is therefore more able to segregate these individuals within prisons and also provide various counseling to detainees and provide extensive support to families of detainees. Also, as a conclusion, I would say that the Saudi Arabia is the most comprehensive and well-funded program of all the current de-radicalization programs in existence. And the program consists of religious psychological counseling for the participant and a reintegration process after release from prison. And the same is implemented in many countries such as Yemen, such as Indonesia, also in the United States as well. So this is Stuart.
Yes, sir.
I am done with my presentation.
Okay, so if you just stop sharing your screen.
Okay.
And I will open it to the floor for any questions to Mr. Denny.
Okay.
Mr. Mohammed, have you got your hand up to ask a question, or is it just up from?
Yes, Stuart. I have a few questions, and excellent presentation by Declan. I think it's also an area I've looked at in the past with regards to de-radicalization programs in prisons, mainly specific in Europe. On his statistics, I understand that 90% of the detainees in Saudi Arabia, that is a success. But you have not indicated the percentage. What is the percentage of those detainees who've gone out and hardcore? As we know, it's very difficult to de-radicalize the hardcore terrorists. So what percentage of those? And you have compared the de-radicalization program in the Saudi Arabia and the United Kingdom, such as an example of Usman Khan. Are you suggesting the de-radicalization programs in the UK are not effective? Because when you look at it, you are research based on the Islamist terrorism. But in the UK also, within the prison settings, there have been an increase of radicalized right-wing extremists. How do you compare that in terms of the success of the Saudi Arabia and the United Kingdom de-radicalization program? And there's so many programs, and also the what strategy in terms of counter-terrorism strategy in Saudi Arabia compared to United Kingdom context strategy. So those are my questions, Declan.
Denny.
Thank you.
Okay, I will try to answer first. Saudi officials and government exclude hardcore terrorists from participating in the aftercare program, especially because to avoid actually increase in failness. So my point is that Saudi Arabia mostly focus on minor terrorists who maybe in the future could become hardcore terrorists. So that's why they actually focused on minor terrorists. United Kingdom didn't actually direct their resources in aftercare program, So that's why I think that is terrorist recidivism is much higher than compared to Saudi Arabia. For example, after they have been released, they gave him £50 and one night in hostel, which is not good approach in my when I compare to other programs such as Saudi Arabia. Also, how I'm comparing success, especially I'm not sure about this last one question, to be honest.
Okay, I mean that's fine. Maybe that would be an area for research. So I think in terms of if we are to assess the UK and Saudi Arabia, in terms of when you compare the number of terrorist incidents, the number of terrorist offenders that have been arrested, actually UK have the highest than the Saudi Arabia, because this is if you look at post 9/11. So in terms of the aftercare,
I mean,
UK they will only
mostly incarcerate also hardcore terrorists, Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, but UK will not say will de-radicalize only minor. We will leave the hardcore. So in terms of suggesting UK de-radicalization programs are effective in terms of our analysis, I will not suggest that at this stage, because there is a limitation in terms of you look at your research in Saudi, you cannot compare to the UK in terms of number of offenders, number of incidents, and you have the UK has right and left wing extremisms that have been arrested as well. That goes through those programs compared to the United Kingdom, the Saudi Arabia as well, who only have the Islamist terrorism. So in terms of my last question will be in terms of future recommendations for in terms of the effectiveness of the radicalization or the limitations seen, because the most advantage that the Saudi Arabia has when the detainees have been released, being given Saudi riyals up to $3,000 US, $3,000 to $5,000 US, compared to the UK having £50 a night. So that I think is only financial limitations rather than I will say rather than the ineffectiveness of such programs. Would you agree with that?
I mean, partially, because, for example, if they been more incentive and they more support them and give them like more purpose, and not just you are just now out of the prison, you can if you can find a job because you are actually a criminal or terrorist offender. So I think if they gave them more money under proper surveillance as well, and it gave them actually a sense of belongings, and because they're after the prison, there is a lot of identity crisis. They don't feel belong in the society, and that's why they reoffend. So I think that's their approach. It's not good enough to be successful.
Yeah, when you look at specific for a case of Osman Khan, and he a lot, let's say for the UK, a lot of ex-terrorist offenders, they have been using these programs as a getaway to get out of prisons. So as a result of that Osman case, they have increased they've increased part of the review. So I think it will be yes, it's very interesting part of future research and a very interesting debate, which will not go into that. But excellent presentation and well done, Declan.
Thank you, Miss.
Thank
I
you.
would say too.
Yeah.
Well done, Denny. I did have a question.
Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah. Did you want me to ask it or move on? So yeah.
Yeah, if you can, sure. I'm interested. I've been following the de-radicalization program in Indonesia, which, like Singapore, probably has one of the best de-radicalization programs in the world right now. So in a comparative between Singapore being a predominantly non-Muslim country, Indonesia is a predominantly Muslim country. So my question was, do you think that Muslim countries are more effective in their de-radicalization programs? And it would be just like, well, this might be a bad comparison, but it takes an alcoholic to help stop an alcoholic. However, once you stop alcoholism, the underlying conditions are still there that caused them to do it in the first place. So do you think non-Muslim countries are more effective? And is it just, warehousing criminals keeps them off the street? In this case, it would be terrorists, foreign terrorist fighters.
Actually, I've been mostly reading, and there is mostly country that contains majority of Muslim population.
Mhm.
So I think I could say that the Muslim country are more effective than non-Muslim country in de-radicalization. I could make that conclusion after my research. Also, for example, Yemen de-radicalization initiatives. It can be compared, but because Yemen don't have like financial resources like Saudi Arabia. So I think a lot of factors actually influence on de-radicalization successful, if is de-radicalization effective or not. So if we want to assess one country, I think we should look into all factors, the individual disengagement factors, then GDP of the country, economical, education, everything should be taken into account before making this kind of conclusion. But I would agree that that Muslim country actually are more successful in the radicalization program.
I would agree also. Thank you, Danny. Great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all.
Absolutely, Denny. Thank you so much for coming on. And yeah, the research paper is fantastic that you've just presented on, and you presented that fantastically and professionally, and I'm sure everyone will agree. And well done holding your own with Mohammed and Todd there. So we will now move on to our next intern, Mr. Matthew Shaw. So Matt is from the UK. He's from Plymouth, all the way down south. He is completing his Masters in Social Policy at Plymouth Margin University this August, where amongst his Master's thesis, where he's researched potential pathways for the rehabilitation and reintegration of British children in Syrian refugee camps. This is such an interesting topic at the moment. Throughout his Masters, he has also researched topics that included the history of disarmament, demobilization and reintegration in the African region, and the rise of the incel culture as a form of extremism in the US. Matt has recently completed an internship position working alongside the Criminology and Forensic Investigation Department at Plymouth Margin University. He assisted in lecture presentations, practical lab assistance, and contributed to a research project on behalf of the Arts and Humanities faculties as an aid to program experience. This has also allowed him to participate in European PhD study at the School for Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences, assessing psychological, sexual, verbal, financial, and physical violence between intimate partners. Matt also holds a first-class honours degree in criminology and also attained from Plymouth Margin University, for which he submitted a first-class dissertation analysing the motivations of European women to Iraq and Syria to join Daesh or ISIS. He also currently holds an ACT awareness training certificate and IHASCO certificates in safeguarding adults and children. With that, I would like to welcome Matt to the floor. He's got a fantastic presentation lined up that he's worked super hard on. So Matt, over to you, sir.
Hi, thanks for that, Stuart. Well done there, Benny. Good job on your presentation. I'm just going to fire straight into it, I think. It's probably the best way, so I'll hit the share screen button. And hopefully now you should see the first page of the presentation. So I'll just start for you there. So my presentation is looking at the incel subculture and whether it should be regarded as a form of extremism. Once I can get my mouse to work, it'll be better. There we go. So first off, I just want to put a quick dedication and almost like a disclaimer in. As a Plymouth resident for the last 10 years, I'd like to dedicate the finding of this research project to those affected by the harrowing incident that happened on Thursday, the 12th of August, 2021. Any inferences made in this report reflecting that attack do not may all the victims of that atrocity please rest in peace. So now we've got the bleak bit out of the way, we can get started. So brief contents page, just explain what I'm going to talk about throughout the presentation. The first section looked at the introduction, definition, and origins. The second looks at the ideology, the manosphere, and the use of manifestos. The third looks at the move to physical violence from the online space. The fourth is just some of my own reflections and some personal thoughts, and then the references as usual in academic writing. So as a brief introduction, the term incel is taken from the term involuntary celibate. It originated in 1993 from a young Canadian woman, often referred to as Alana or sometimes referred to as Alana X. She coined the term to describe her failure to find a romantic partner. When the movement first appeared online in 1997, the global reach and accepted nature of the site led to a steady increase in users in the preceding 3 years. It offered support for all genders, providing assistance and a space for similar-minded individuals to share experiences and ideas as to how they could affect positive change. The period 1999 to 2010 saw the dynamics of the online space changed. They became heavily populated with representatives of the pickup artist troupes of the early 20th century. They were made famous by such TV shows as The Pickup Artists on VH1 and MTV. The space was also populated by men's rights activists and anti-feminist groups such as Men Going Their Own Way, often shortened to MG-TOW or MG-TOW. All of these groups that started to take over the incel space, use their sense of rejection as a basis to exact revenge against women. This was initially through online trolling, referred to shitposting or networked misogyny. This included memes, anti-women YouTube videos, and at times extended to physical stalking. Documented experience and actions of the victims are evident at the secret world of incels. So the move to violence and mass murder is accepted by academics and non-government organizations who follow the culture to have begun in May 2014 with the Elliot Rodger attack in Santa Barbara, California, for which he was labeled by the incel community as the Supreme Gentleman. However, researchers have recently begun to cite the 1989 Montreal Polytechnic shooting by Mark Lepine as a potential incident foreshadowing the movement's ideology. A further example of the ideology potentially at play is that of the Columbine shootings in 1999. So I just want to provide some definitions as to what the incel subculture actually really is about, I suppose. For this presentation, the term incel will be used according to definitions outlined by CSIS and RAND. They were both chosen as they're reflective of American and European views on the ideology, and that is the area that I've sort of chosen to focus my studies on. The CSIS definition is provided by Jones, Doxey, and Harrington 2020. They described the incel movement as being an online movement composed of primarily young males. They subscribe to the belief that physical characteristics predetermine their place in society and that women are solely responsible for the hierarchy that can be seen in today's society and that works to oppress men. The RAN definition, which provides definition used in Europe, quotes inceldom to be a spectrum characterized by a multifaceted community. The beliefs facilitate the notion that they cannot access sex due to genetic factors, evolutionary predetermined processes of partner selection, or as a result of societal structures. So the American definition and the European definition are very, very similar. The term networked misogyny, which I mentioned earlier, is found frequently in the available literature, and it's often applied to the content of the manosphere. It often revolves around discussions in the online space that cause harassment of women through sexist speech, the use of pornographic imagery, threats of violence and rape. Like this are usually carried out by organized groups who seek to further escalate the abuse of women, and they're then incentivized to go further by other members of the communities. Whilst the literature surrounding the incel subculture is very much still in its infancy, known academics and extremism think tanks have started to now look at the subculture, and there is a wealth of research undertaken by published PhD students. These include Violence and Radicalization in the Internet Manosphere by Price, The Misogyny Within the Manosphere by Whitland, and I'd Kill for a Girl Like That, The Black Pill, and The Incel Uprising, all of which were published last year. The next slide just looks at some similarities with the incel subculture and some groups that are already deemed by law enforcement to be extremist or terrorist groups. The first similarity is that the subculture exists with an us versus them mentality and is fueled by online echo chambers. The ideology, the culture, is driven by an extreme ideology and rhetoric. People who subscribe to the culture feel ignored by political and social entities. The culture is also seen to direct violence towards others, including the murder of random victims. The subculture also uses manifestos to promote their culture, their ideology, and to teach others how to promote or carry out attacks. And both provide an increase in the level of threat to public safety. So the next slide, looks a bit more into depth at the manosphere and looks at the black pill. This is an analogy that's taken from the Matrix movie, which hence the picture of Morpheus. He's talking about the reality to Neo. He offers a choice to take a blue pill, which means to remain to a slave to the illusion, taking a red pill, which means you accept the illusion further, and offers the black pill analogy. Subscribing to this ideology indicates an acceptance that the individual was ugly, they'll never be rich, they will never have sex, and therefore they are destined for a life of rejection. The ideology also assumes that there are political and social constructs at play aimed at keeping men oppressed and promoting the value of women in society. The black pill ideology is driven in numerous subreddits across the internet. Our brain cell, our incel support. There are actually a number of subreddits that have been banned. There's a recent study that's now looking at Reddit content, YouTube content, and Facebook content that's going through peer review at the moment. As of 2021, there's been a marked increase in content removal from mainstream social media channels. This sort of originated post the Elliot Rodger attack in 2014. The next slide just shows some of the characters that make the first picture shows the Virgin and Chad. The Virgin is representative of incels and how they would self-describe themselves. Common traits associated with incels are shyness, tenseness, a rigid yet slouched appearance, often at pains to avoid eye contact or physical contact, and wearing neutral clothes to blend in and not draw any attention to themselves. The Chad is the opposite to the Virgin or the incel. He is any male that's deemed above average looking. They often have perfect posture, maintain frequent eye contact, overly confident, super fashionable, and their hands are always active and ready for physical contact. The next two characters in the manosphere are the Becky and the Stacy. They represent the female side of the online space, I guess. The Becky represents an average woman whose character traits intact, can be described as a little bit of a nerd, often into social justice causes, and has an intense dislike for Stacey because she's able to have relationships with men that would be deemed as Chads, I suppose. The Stacey's next to her. She is a stereotypical beautiful woman. often promiscuous, a massive emphasis on looks, usually fake breasts and implants. Often they're rich, glamorous, spoiled, and they spend a lot of their time in relationships with chads. The third picture shows a bit of a linkage as to why I personally think that the subculture, if not already a form of extremism, is already verging on it. One of the links to this is their closeness with the far right. This is indicated in the bottom picture, which shows what they refer to in the manosphere as a Chad St. Brenton, which is Brenton Tarrant. Traits attributed to him include mass murder, but that was done with the benefit of preventing rapes of Stacey's and Becky's, i.e. the subculture automatically assumes that the rape of women is often carried out by immigrants as opposed to the people, just normal people. The other people in that third picture are John and Patrick. They're far-right sympathizers, like-mind extremists who quote the inspiration of others in their content. They subscribe primarily to the political oppression aspect of the ideology, which is why they follow in the far-right sympathizers list. The image on the right-hand side there is just an example of the sort of typical content that you would find in the manosphere. It's mostly memes, as I spoke about earlier on. One of the things that also always comes up first within incels is the opinion that it's always about sex. Yes, sex plays a massive part in the subculture, but so since the events of May 2014, the new incel subculture can be seen as a direct response opposing the rise of feminism in modern society. This shift often results from the site's manipulation primarily by disgruntled white heterosexual young men who continue to feel isolated, withdrawn from society, and forgotten by women. A common driving factor that is often overlooked when dealing with the subculture is the political views that society, media, and politics will bear towards women. In doing so, they reference such statistics as high rates of suicide, threats of conscription, and the fact that girls are seen to be outperforming men academically, which is causing men to feel like they've been left behind. These statistics are always in the public realm, and the culture holds up academics such as Jordan Peterson, Warren Farrell, or Red Pill film director, feminist Cassidy J to add value and weight to these beliefs. However, the subculture's belief that the patriarchal family structure and systematic power play in work and the overall privilege has caused many of these scholars to face a backlash because they're not talking about these issues ethically or peacefully, and often relating them to violence. Some examples of the extreme political rhetoric seen in the manosphere can be shown by the idea of formation of concentration camps for women, state-sponsored girlfriends, and even a call for wiping out the most of the existing alpha men and women. The next page just shows another part of the linkage for me, and that is the use of manifestos. Here I have a few. The first three are extracts from incel manifestos, Chris Harper Mercer, Elliot Rodger, and a tweet from Alex Manassian released prior to his attack in Canada. The next manifesto is that of Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris. This is actually their diaries, but it was extracts from this that formed each one's individual manifesto. The next often tightly entangled within the incel subculture. And they're Brenton Tarrant's, Anders Breivik's, and of course, Adolf Hitler's. The last two are slightly different. One is driven more by political ideology, and that's Mark Lepine's Anti-Feminist Manifesto from 1989. And the last one ties them both together, really, the incel subculture and far-right views in Nazism. And that's from Tobias Raffian, and it showed in it links to the far-right and incel ideologies. So this next little part just looks at the threat moving from the online space into the real world. This is deemed as going ER. It's a term that's coined from Elliot Rodger's manifesto and equates to mass murder and mass violence. Attacks carried out by members of the incel sub-community, have often been planned months in advance, and in some cases promote upcoming attack. The online space often actively encourages causing maximum casualties. A study by Speckard and Ellenberg 2021 found that in a survey of 272 participants claiming to be an incel, 18% of which reported a diagnosis for autism spectrum disorder, including Asperger's. There's also a second study done by Kelly and Arnsbach in 2020, of which 44% reported experiencing symptoms of autism, including self-harm and a predisposition for violence. I have to put my hand up here and say, I don't know exactly what the figure was for their total respondents, but the 44% is still high, irrelevant of the number. In some cases, I missed that out. The mental health crisis within the subculture, coupled with the encouragement of others and the inherent value of their so-called mission, provides a volatile concoction of factors that would further promote the individual's motivation to carry out any attack. In some cases, it's often the affected individual's first experience of pride in their actions and any form of adulation from others. The unfamiliar nature of these feelings can manifest themselves in a sense of power for the individual. The increase in feelings of power therefore helps to alleviate some of the fears that a perpetrator may have, and this is often shown by the willingness of perpetrators to end their attack through suicide or being killed intentionally at the scene. So these 6 people here are some of the more media famous incel attacks that have been carried out in the last sort of 10 years, apart from Mark Lepine there. A striking factor from those 6 people is that they are all predominantly middle-aged, 20 to 40-year-old white men. Moving in with the violence, the above just shows a timeline of the more media attacks that have been more promoted. William Atkinson, Nicholas Cruz, Alec Manassian, Scott Bieler, Connor Betts, Armando Hernandez Jr., Tobias Fathian, and Jake Davison in Plymouth. Although that last one, I'm just going to point this out because it isn't my decision yet, I'm still researching this, but the Anti-Defamation Society and League have stated that he was driven by an incel ideology. Comparing the incel attacks in North America and Canada, in the same time, the US and UK have faced a total of 108 attacks since 2014, of which only 14 have taken place on American soil. So the number is are pretty much the same, but the incel subculture doesn't seem to be getting any attention. Another factor that makes this a little bit more frightening personally for me is the fact that on top of the attacks that have been carried out in the last 2 years, there's at least another 9. And I found out today about another one in Edinburgh that was. So where do we go from here? And what do we do now? The incel subculture is not new at all in the online space. Recent incidents have proved that neither is their activity in the real world. The nature of the subculture and its perceived immaturity, as shown by the content and linguistics of the manosphere, appear to deflect from the serious nature of the threat the community presents. Law enforcement agencies across the globe need to start to reconsider the subculture and assess its activities in the same manner as Islamist or far-right extremists. To do this, they need to apply the universally accepted definition of terrorism to the subculture. The person I always look to when defining terrorism is Newman, and that's one of the definitions that I've taken today. Using his 2005 definition, which describes terrorism as a deliberate creation of a sense of fear, usually by the threat or use of symbolic acts of physical violence to influence the political behavior of a given target group. As shown in this presentation, the incel subculture meets these criteria, deemed now as a form of extremism. Some of the political grievances that the group share are worthy of debate in the political sphere. Men's mental health and education are prime examples of this. This does not excuse the violence and hate-fueled content that makes up the space that they inhabit, but feelings of isolation and the increased screen time used during lockdown has allowed more individuals to get caught up in online echo chambers that often only subscribe to extreme versions of any ideology. This can be incel, far-right, religious, you name it. You can get an extreme version of anything online. So just in closing and summing up, as the number of attacks increases, security officials must recognize the threat for what it is, a genuine threat to public safety. Coupled with this, safeguarding agencies such as educators, trauma aftercare services, and mental health services need to talk to those involved in the subculture and gain further understanding of their grievances. Whilst their stories may represent twisted versions of reality and present a lot of uncomfortable discussions, addressing these issues will be the first steps in creating a strategy to combat what I would call a new form of extremism. And the last slide is your typical references, and just a massive thank you for listening to me, really. And that's the end.
Thank you so much, Matt. My gosh, that was a lot of info.
I don't know. How do I get it to stop share? Okay, there we go.
You know, before I go to questions, I want to say myself that incel as a subculture is an area that I don't know too much about. So that was really informative and I really enjoyed that. So thank you. We do have a question. I'm going to hand the floor over to Andrew to ask his question.
Yeah. Hi, Matt. Thank you for your insightful talk. I appreciate that there's work being done on this because it does redefine what we perceive as terror threats. So I think this work is definitely salient. Now, is how do you think that these revisionary policies on public media are affecting the way these movements are being catalyzed, even in more open spaces rather than these awkward subreddits or whatever else? Even if you have reasonable conservative friends, you'll see them complain that, look, Trump's Twitter is being banned, but the leaders of Taliban are still having active Twitter accounts, so much for freedom of speech or whatever else. How do you think that these arguments can be contextualized in the incel culture, and what do you see the ramifications of these policies?
Half the problem and half the reason why the incel subculture is growing is the feminist framing in the media. It's looking a lot. I'm actually currently researching the Jake Davison case in Plymouth, the shooting last week. Looking at public perception of it, it's all very much, we've had people from Georgetown University, people from Exeter University talking about the subculture, but they are always shot down as people who identify with this as being kids, stupid, immature, lacking sex. And actually, there are a lot of problems that do need to be spoken about. One of the things that's coming up at the moment in conversations that I'm having is with regards to Afghanistan. The media is very much about getting girls and women out of the country. There's been very little talk about what happens to young men or young boys in that area. And I think the media framing is fueling this, and getting conversations out into massive spaces is going to be really difficult because it goes against what everything else is trying to say. Everything else is trying to say that men hold the power, women are still, I don't know really how to say it, sort of exist on a level below women, and that's not true. There's plenty of statistics there that prove that it is actually changing. In terms of censorship and everything, I don't think there's any way to get around it. If you close Reddit, if you close Facebook, if you close LinkedIn, then they move to 4chan, Kiwi Farm, 8chan, and everything, and they're not regulated. There's not enough knowledge in the public about those sorts of places, and I think they're the dangerous spaces, and this is where this is going to grow.
Good. So what's the alternative then? If you would be in charge, if you were a policymaker as an internet mod or something along those lines, or someone with sufficient power in the media to say something prescriptive about it, because you see, usually when groups get unnoticed and they have a violent bent, that's when it really becomes dangerous, right? So what would you do?
At present,
Matt, we can't hear you.
We can't hear you.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's going to be really interesting. I'm not entirely sure as to how we combat it or how we deal with it. I think the first thing that we need to do is smash down some of these like illusions that it's just ugly men, for example, sat in their computer with nothing else to do. Gavin Williamson came out last week, and said that he will be taking steps to discuss the culture within education settings. I, for one, am intrigued as to how he's going to do that, because I have no idea how you're going to get that message across to people. I've got a 17-year-old daughter who's been heavily affected by the attack that's up the road, but they haven't gone back to school yet, and it's almost as though everybody's moved on. Events elsewhere in the world have overshadowed it. How I would go about teaching people, stopping it, I'm not entirely sure. I think the first thing that we need to do is sort of accept that it is a problem. It's not just a bunch of dejected young men sitting in their computer rooms with nothing else to do.
Brilliant presentation. I learned a little bit there. Matt, yeah, I have a question for you. So in the past, in convictions for criminality, one used a defense that, excess sugar made me do it. And so can you also say at the same time that if there is equality out there, would there be less of this incel subculture? I mean, if I wasn't taught correctly that I have opportunity, I can go to school, I can become education, and if I, do the right thing, I'm going to do good in life, and that includes attracting the right mate. But at the same time, when to me, you would say, the way that we talk to one another usually has an influence on how things end up. And so if you're talking to the Stacys and the Beckys and whatnot, or you're not, I guess I'm curious as to if you believe that equality would stop all this, because men do have the opportunity to go to school and get educated. And so is it being used in a sense as a defense to define a new category of people and list them as terrorism? Or would you just say that, well, you have these opportunities, get out of your basement, get off your headset, out of your game chair, and go start doing something in life, be productive. Don't sit around and complain. You see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, I find it really difficult. There's already almost a response to the incel movement from females, which is in subreddits, and it's known as FDS, which is female dating strategy, and it's all about the manipulation of men, etc., etc. One of the things, and I've spoken to Stuart about this as well, is I can identify with some of the things that the culture goes on with in terms of the neoliberalism approach to education. Go to school, get the qualifications, get the job, have the dream life. That's really, really difficult. I had a divorce at 34, went back to university, did my foundation degree, did my undergraduate degree, just completed my master's, and I've applied for 120 jobs and I'm not getting anywhere. I've done everything that I've been told to do, and I still feel a little bit left on by the wayside. And I think that's a massive issue. And I think this is something that, yes, the sex and the girlfriend and not having a girlfriend is a massive part of the culture. Another sort of aspect that isn't talked about is the fact that people are living longer. There's more people in the world. The amount of jobs and everything is still finite. You're going to have people that can do all the right things and still not get the opportunities that they feel like they deserve. And that then drives people to look for alternatives. And that's when you run the risk of running into the echo chambers and everything like that.
Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it. And that's exactly the answer I was looking for. And it's not that you've done anything wrong. That's not it at all to me. I mean, that's just my opinion. There's jobs out there. I had to start out flipping burgers at McDonald's. I had to start out doing all kinds of jobs, laboring, before I was able to understand that, the education and what I put into my productive life, the amount, and that meant working a full-time job and a part-time job for 20 years. And that's usually sometimes what you have to do to raise a family. But in your case, I understand exactly. I appreciate you sharing what you just did. Most people would have just never said anything. And, jobs are out there. The right jobs are out there. And for you, you're at the right place at the right time, doing the right thing. And that's more of a motivational speech for you, that you can accomplish anything if you just do it. Put one foot in front of the other, keep trying, and good things will happen. Thank you.
No problem. You're welcome.
Right, we do have a couple more, but I'm not gonna I'm going to just ask two. One of them actually Mo stole off me, which was my question I was going to ask. So we'll ask that one first, then we'll ask Adam's to close the session. And if there's any more, Matt can answer in the chat box so we can move the webinar forwards. So, Mr. Mohammed, should incel be?
It should. It meets the definition. It does. Beneath the sex, there isn't a want to affect political change. It wants more equality between men and women, and I think that is portrayed in the manosphere. The extremes that they think that feminism is taking over the world, and that's not the truth. That's not the case at all. Things are changing. Feminism is becoming more popular, and I think people are starting to just find that as a sort of rejection, and that is then fueling a sort of fuels us versus them. I don't subscribe to this feminist movement that everything needs to be this way, and I don't agree with the equality and equity debate either. And I think that's the problem that the manosphere does, is exaggerated all of those things, and the political motivation is there once you get away from the sex. And I just think that is on the sex, and they need to move away from that. Once you can move away from that, I think then you can start to strengthen the links as to why it should be viewed as extremism or terrorism.
Brilliant. Okay, and thank you, Matt. And the last one we'll open up. I'll let Adam ask this actually himself rather than me read it out, because it's quite a long-winded question. So Adam, I'll offer the floor to you for the final question for Matt today.
Absolutely, Matt, you did a fantastic job. So Alex Manassan did rent a van, and he ran over 16 people in Toronto. We have legalized prostitution in the province of Ontario, so I have a hard time believing that he did this because he was celibate. You can go and get it for $50 or go rent a Q van for $300. So I just don't see the metrics in this one. Like, it seems like a scapegoat defense to me.
I can come back to you on that one. Within the incel subculture itself, the act of paying for sexual gratification is looked down on. So it might be something that he may have done, but it wouldn't have been something that he would have said to the community, I guess. I think there were other issues at play with him. I think there were mental health issues as well. And it's been quite interesting, especially in Canada, because they seem to be one of the only nations that are sort of starting to take this issue seriously. I know in Britain with this one, there was the one in Plymouth and the one in Edinburgh, but I've done presentations similar to this in university and been laughed at. So I think there was a political meaning there. I think there were mental health issues there. The fact that there's legal prostitution, it still goes against the incel subculture thing, where actually there is a term for it that I can't remember off the top of my head, which is actually for people that pay for sexual gratification. So I'm not entirely sure that having the option to go and get just sex would have stopped it. I think there is a part of it where the incel subculture, they want the girlfriend, not just for sex. They want her to do what were perceived as the traditional female roles in the household as well. So they almost want them to be subservient, going back to 100 years ago when the wife was there to cook dinner, have sex, pleasure the husband, and all those sorts of things. I think that drives a lot of the undercurrent, I guess, as opposed to just the sex. The sex is very good and it's very commercial, and it draws people of the age that makes up the manosphere in really, really easily. I think if they were to sort of try and draw people in with the political undertones of the subculture, then it wouldn't be as big as what it is.
Great job, Matt. Thank you.
No worries.
Thank you, Matt. I'm going to close your questions there, but if you go to the chat box, my friend, you'll see some of the questions if you want to answer in chat there, and we will move the webinar forward. So thank you so much, Matt, for that. Was an absolutely phenomenal presentation. Really, really thought-provoking. Righty. So we have next Mr. Sumit, who is one of our interns again. Mr. Sumit Mishra has recently completed a Master's in War in the Modern World from King's College London and holds an MSc from Imperial College London and a Bachelor of Engineering from the Queen's Mary University of London. Zoom has a strong interest in the field of geopolitics and international relations and has gained significant exposure in situation analysis, risk assessment through educational research and a professional career in finance. His main research interests are conflicts and insurgency related to non-state actors with a special focus on the Islamic State. So he is a super interesting guy and I look forward to handing the floor over to him. So off you go, my friend. It's all yours.
Thank you, Stuart, for the kind introduction, and thank you, Matt. That was an excellent presentation. As Stuart mentioned, even I didn't have too much information on that topic, but certainly after your presentation, I know a few things here and there now. So thank you for that. So hello, everyone. As Stuart mentioned, my name is Sumit Mishra, and in the next 15 minutes or so, hopefully, I will be taking you through my presentation on the evolution of Islamic State in the Sahel region. And I will start by sharing my screen. Please let me know if it's visible to you guys, and then I will kick off.
Yes, it is.
Thank you, Madison. So to start with my first slide, so on the first slide, I have a quick recap of the Islamic State, and I'm not going into too much of detail here, as I'm assuming most of us are already familiar with the emergence and the murderous conduct of this group. So to start with, it is a self-styled Salafist jihadist group, and also goes by the name ISIS, ISIL, Daesh, which is mostly used by the defectors or the enemies. And for the sake of this presentation, I will be using the term IS or Islamic State interchangeably. Now, this group emerged into the global conscience in early 2004, when in rapid successions, they captured swathe of territories in Iraq and Syria, and soon proclaimed that their captured territories would be combined under an Islamic political religious entity, let's call it caliphate, to be called Islamic State, with its first caliph as Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. At the height of its power in September 2015, they controlled almost 88,000 square kilometers of territory with approximately 8 million inhabitants. And that's almost same size as Jordan, and population-wise, that's more than the entire population of the United Kingdom. However, the diabolical reign of Islamic State did not last long, and by late 2017, the group had lost almost 85% of its territory to the anti-IS coalition, which was a mix of regional countries, sub-state actors, and international powers. And by March 2019, they lost its last pocket of territory in eastern Syria. Now, at this stage, a legitimate question that can be asked is, if the so-called Islamic State or the Caliphate is in ruins in Iraq and Syria, then who are these groups using in Mozambique earlier this year? And only a few days ago, actually, another group under the same banner carried out the Kabul airport suicide bombing. And the answer is the Islamic State affiliates, or what they would like to call it, Vilayat. Now, this decentralized strategy of operating through affiliates has stretched the Islamic State's operational area beyond Syria and Iraq, as far as South and Southeast Asia and Africa. So it's vital to understand the IS affiliate structure and its characteristics before we dive into its affiliates in the Sahel region. That will take us to our next slide. So on slide 2, I have how the affiliate or the Vilayat operating model of Islamic State works. Before we go into that, it is worth highlighting that the term Vilayat is from the 7th century Islamic expansion, ruled under the name and authority of the caliph. And of course, it goes without saying that Islamic State is using this term to also emphasize on its so-called Islamic legitimacy. As Todd mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, that terrorism is kind of working as a business. So we can view the IS affiliate structure as a venture capitalist model, really, where a few bad guys are trying to convince Islamic State that they are worth Islamic State's resources and its brand. So let's say this is Islamic State core, and a terrorist group which is aligned to IS philosophy, let's say somewhere in Asia, pledges their bayah or allegiance to the Caliph and the Islamic State. Now, depending on the history of this group, and if it fits the strategic vision of our venture capitalist Islamic State, IS may accept their bayah and raise them to the allegiance is accepted, and now it's called Islamic State in Asia. And now Islamic State provides them with weapons, funds, and access to IS propaganda network, for example, a mark, and a global network of sympathizers. Now, when this Islamic State in Asia carries out an attack, Islamic State core will always claim an equity in the devastation and impact produced by this attack. This actually shows how the influence of Islamic State is going beyond what was considered their home turf in Iraq and Syria. Now, this whole franchising strategy or the affiliate strategy in the Salafi jihadi realm is not a new concept, really. And in fact, Al-Qaeda has been operating through its affiliates for almost a decade now. And Islamic State's predecessor, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI, was an Al-Qaeda franchise itself. But what So while Al-Qaeda affiliates tries to attack Western targets and their backed regimes, Islamic State's primary focus is to destabilize local governments and to reestablish the caliphate regionally, which also aligns to its slogan, Baqiya wa Tatmadad, which means remaining and expanding. And as the last point I have on this slide is the Islamic State affiliate strategy is basically, we can summarize it in 3 points: fight locally, institute limited governance, and expand its outreach. So that finishes my second slide, and we are on slide 3, which brings us to the core of our discussion, the evolution of Islamic State in the Sahel. So the Sahel region of Africa, I have highlighted in the top map on the right, and pockets within this region have been quite disturbed by the Salafi jihadi tendencies recently, with Islamic State. The map shows the Islamic State's aspiration for Africa. Luckily, it's not a reality yet. When we talk about provinces or the Vilayat in Africa, Africa is home to 3 major Islamic State provinces. We have ISWAP, that's Islamic State West Africa Province, which also includes the ISGS, that's Islamic State in Greater Sahara, and we will be discussing that in detail. The operational jurisdiction for this province is Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and Chad Basin. Then we have ISCAP, Islamic State Central Africa Province, which predominantly operates in DRC and Mozambique. And it is alleged that ISCAP was behind the Mozambique attack earlier this year. Now, the third province that we have is the Sinai province, which of course covers the Egypt and the Sinai region. We have other provinces like a small minor provinces or affiliates as well. For this presentation, we will be focusing on the western part of the Sahel region, which includes the tri-junction of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, which is commonly called the Liptako-Goram region. Now, so far, whenever we think about or what we have discussed so far about Islamic State, we understand that they use religion as a tool to expand its influence. But it is worth noting that the driving force behind the non-state actors in the Sahel region, or Western Sahel region, let's call it, is to a lesser extent due to ideological narratives. And primary instigators are an intricate combination of economic and development challenges, weak and corrupt states, brutal oppression of dissidents, and neo-colonialism. what Islamic State is doing, they are simply exploiting these conditions, which has helped in its evolution in that region. So let's the first one we'll look at is socio-economic conditions. So countries in the Western Sahel region rank right at the bottom of the 2020 United Nations Human Development Index, with Burkina Faso coming as 182, Mali as 184, and Niger as 189 out of the 189 countries in this region. So that clearly shows the Human Development Index for these countries. And the national governments in these countries are all ill-equipped to tackle socioeconomic issues, especially in the urban areas. And a good example is northern Mali, where a weak state presence and its policies added to the continuous dissatisfaction of marginalized and vulnerable populations. Now, this is also supplemented by the ethnic fault lines in the society, such as the skirmishes between the ethnic Fulani and the Tuareg communities. And Salafi jihadis, a timely and powerful agent of mobilization. For example, in some areas, they're trying to fill gaps in governance and service delivery to generate support that the respective national governments never enjoyed due to their inability to provide these services. And if you take an example of any local recruit by the Salafi jihadist groups, the ideology is actually the least of their motivation, and instead local grievances as well as monetary incentives provided by the parent group are the primary mobilizers. And an example I would use is the dreaded Islamic State terrorist, Dondu Shefu, who led the attack on the joint Niger-US contingent in 2017. He had little interest in jihad and only picked up weapons, well, at least initially, to protect his livestock from the Tuareg community along the Niger-Mali border. And during interrogations of several captured Salafi jihadist militia members in this region, it has been established that either they were coerced into terrorism or they voluntarily joined for money, as they demonstrate no understanding of the ideological narrative. And in some cases, they don't even know who they are fighting for. So that takes us to our next point, that is counterproductive policies and neo-colonialism. To understand this section more kind of in a better way, let's talk it from the Western perspective first. So the dominant Western narrative of counterterrorism and religious extremism muddles the actual underlying localized issues, which results into ineffective and counterproductive policies of the West, which actually runs a major risk of providing support to unpopular administrations and, of course, deter any policy changes. Moreover, the neo-colonialistic practices of West and now China tends to demean African state sovereignty through asymmetric economic relations and inequitable trade and investment between the parties, which basically overall chokes African growth prospects. What these groups like Islamic States are doing, they're encashing on all these opportunities and also becoming responsive to local sentiments and wider national politics by building their propaganda on anti-colonialism, like them versus us, and exhibiting their presence as the local liberator. Now, that was from the Western or kind of outsider aspect. From a domestic point of view, the Sahelian government's iron fist response and the lack of a viable counterterrorism strategy, unlike just we have in the UK or in Europe, to deal with the insurgent threat has only increased violence and inter-community tensions, which ultimately pushes victims into the arms of jihadists. And one of the top reasons would be the gross human rights abuses by security forces, and its even the security apparatus of these countries are plagued by endemic corruption and structural issues. And I came across an article in the Chatham House, and it stated that in some cases, the security apparatus has been deliberately weakened by the national governments to mitigate the threat of military coups. So these are some of the reasons which facilitated or continues to facilitate the evolution or a strength of Islamic State in that region. That takes me to my next slide, slide 4. where we will discuss the Islamic State affiliate in the Western Sahel region. That's the ISGS, Islamic State in the Greater Sahara. Now, structurally speaking, we are talking about an element of Islamic State of West Africa province, but ISGS mostly operates independent to the ISWAP core. And now, when Boko Haram pledged their bayah to IS core, and the same year, a breakaway faction from an Al-Qaeda affiliate in Sahel, Al-Mortabun, led by Adnan al-Sahrawi, pledged their bayah. But they weren't given the status of an affiliate or vilayat, and even Islamic State core accepted their bayah almost a year later in 2016. Now, what could be the reasons? Possibly this could be because Sahrawi's group was still in a kind of an embryonic form and a relatively small group compared to the Sahelian Al-Qaeda affiliate. And let's call it, they were yet to score a home run at that time. But it did not demotivate Sahrawi and his boys. And for the next few years, Sahrawi's group led significant assaults in the Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso area, especially the ambush of Tongo Tongo in Niger, which led to the death of 4 US Green Berets and 9 Niger troopers. A few years down the line in 2019, ISGS managed to convince Islamic State core that they are worth their attention. And in March 2019, the Islamic State propaganda network, Amaq, started promoting ISGS. But the good news came a month later when Islamic State Caliph al-Baghdadi himself, in a rare audio-video message, praised the Sahrawi and the Sahelian IS terrorists. In 2019, later, ISGS was officially consumed in the ranks of ISWAP. Since 2019, ISGS has led spectacular, deadly attacks in the region, sometimes even eclipsing the core ISWAP. I have shown on the map the 2020 activities and attacks of ISGS, which is far more than any group in that region. Conscious of the time left for my presentation slide and strategy of ISGS, I think it's very much aligned to what we have seen with the core Islamic State, that is to destabilize the local governance, separate people from the local government, start ethnic tensions, establish Sharia order in the governed areas, and also ISGS is countering the Al-Qaeda franchise JNM in this region. It's interesting to note that while Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State were fighting in the rest of the world, Sahel used to be considered an exception, but since 2019, that Sahelian exception doesn't exist, and they continue to attack each other. With almost 700 fighters died between in 2020 alone from Al-Qaeda, from ISGS and JNM. From a strategy point of view, ISGS takes advantage of porous territory to move between the countries, use mobile attack units on motorbikes, which is quite different. And they used to call it the shield of Islam. Other tactics include guerrilla warfare, laying ambushes, using IEDs, etc. That's kind of concludes my presentation, really. And the last point I would like to mention, that to deal with Islamic State, first of all, a combined domestic and international effort is required to deal with the underlying issues in that region. And without doing that, it will be difficult to stop Islamic State or even any other terror organization in that region, because temporary measures or hard power can treat the sick, but it will not be able to treat the underlying disease. Thank you for your time. And now I will be happy to take your questions.
Amazing, Sumit. Amazing. Thank you. Yeah. Any questions? Any?
Very, very interesting presentation. Oh, there's a question.
Oh, yes. Sumit, Mr. Sumit, do you think Mozambique will be the next recruiting hub for ISIS?
I think it's already for if you look at the Islamic State Central Africa province, they're already recruiting heavily in the youth from there. And as I said, I think it's not because of a lot of people there are religiously motivated. It's mainly because some people or some areas within Mozambique are not having basic facilities, and ISIS sometimes claims to provide these facilities. So it's basically like, winning hearts and minds, really. So yeah, to answer your question in short, that yes, Mozambique is definitely one of the recruiting hubs for Islamic State.
Fantastic. Any other questions from the floor? Okay, well, if there's no more, assume it's got off lightly there. If there is any more, please post them in the chat box, and I'm sure Mr. Sumit will answer them there. Now, that gets us halfway through our interns for the evening so far. We're going to hand back to Mr. Todd in a second, I believe. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah, but before I do, I just want to show you my book. I don't know if I can actually.
No, I think you would have to share your screen. I mean, it's there. There you go. The big book of Arabic. Yeah, the big book of Arabic words. Congratulations, Stuart is now a published author.
I am. It's very colorful. It's very colorful, very easy to read and understand. I've got the background blur on, so it's not working very well. But it is a fantastic book with easy pictures, demonstrations of how to say the words in Romanized letters, as well as the Arabic and the meaning as well. So if you are interested, it's on Amazon, the big book of Arabic words. Thank you very much. It ships worldwide, I believe. Okay, I will pass you back to Mr. Todd.
Thanks, Stuart. Brilliant and excellent presentations this morning by our first group of interns. We appreciate your work very much. Besides their presentation projects, they also helped develop our intern operational procedures. So they were the first group that worked with us to put them on paper, and so that future cohorts of interns will follow in their footsteps with how they operate and what they do. We're not just getting interns to do our work. This is about them. And so for our internships, we're now accepting, I believe Stuart's accepting new applications and admissions for the next cohort to begin September 15th. And so now at this time, I'd like to announce our collaboration with the Paris Graduate School Innovative Knowledge Institute. And the way I'd like to do that is to introduce the founder of the Paris Graduate Institute, Dr. Suha Akiki. She is, as I said, the president and founder of Innovative Knowledge Institute. She is a natural communicator, motivator, and leader. She has a rich and varied background spanning a 30-year period in academia, including director-level positions in administration and finance. In her various roles as a strategic developer, leader, academic director, author, and mentor, concurrently with management positions held at academic institutions around the world, Suha has lectured on subjects such as marketing, international business, entrepreneurship, and international relations. Whether in an academic or corporate environment, Suha embraces the challenges and enjoys the diversity of working with international profiles. Members of the panel at UNESCO on October 5th, 2011, the World's Teachers' Day, holding a doctorate in international relations, specialized in the challenges of brain-based learning, and also holds a Master in Business Administration. Suha organized the conference in January 2013 on the Iran nuclear situation versus the Saudi fundamentalist Salafists, which was a very, very insightful topic. Another conference on 2012 was organized on the French intervention in Mali and the economic and business post-war. So at this time, I know we're supposed to be, we're also waiting on General Arakunle Olawunmi, who is the co-developer of our Masters in International Security Studies. At this time, I'd like Dr. Akiki to talk about the Paris Graduate Institute and our new collaboration in our Masters in International Security Studies. So welcome,
Hello,
Dr.
thank
Akiki.
you. Thank you, Todd. Thank you. Good evening, good morning to others. Good evening to us in Paris, and or good day to everybody. So yes, Paris Graduate School, Innovative Knowledge Institute. We started with this name first. I was a director of an American university in Paris, and all of a sudden I said to myself, I have to leave and do what I want. Because I realized after 30 years of academics, I saw that students don't have the same needs and they don't learn the same way. And that's why I had this idea to have the Innovative Knowledge Institute to start teaching differently. That's why I liked the idea of Todd that no exam. I am against exams. I am for research, personal research for students. That's how we learn more than studying like parrots, going and do the exams and forgetting all what we learned or what we studied in 5 minutes later. So that's why even when I was a student, I was against exams. I accepted it because I wanted my degrees. That's it. But after once out, I said, no way, I don't want this anymore to happen to me or to my students. So that's why we created the Innovative Knowledge Institute. And after we added Paris Graduate School to it. Why we cannot use Paris Graduate School alone? Because we don't have the right to use it by itself. We have to add something to Paris Graduate School. So we added to Innovative Knowledge Institute, Paris Graduate School, and we started really having lots of partnerships in Asia and Africa. I'm not looking of partnerships in Europe. I prefer Asia and Africa because I feel the future in these continents. Now we have in Malaysia, we have centers in Malaysia, in Bangladesh, in Africa, in Zambia, and in Malawi, and very soon Ghana. And when Todd contacted me, and I realized that the international security and all what they are doing, really it's complementary to our international relations program. So I accepted right away, and we will have other programs in the pipeline together. And I'm really very proud and happy to work with all of you folks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Suha. We appreciate your sentiments. And like she said, the Masters in International Security Studies, we're almost finished. I mean, our directors have been working on this, General Adekunle Olawunmi, Professor Jordan, and Mohammed Omar, Irfan Yar, Amber Oquindo, and myself. We're actually working diligently every day to try to make sure everything is ready. We have a cohort beginning on Monday. We're proud of that. And we'll slowly but surely integrate all the coursework into the Paris model. So with that, the MIS degree, and since Professor Jordan is not here, I'll just go ahead and present for him. The MIS degree covers most of the aspects and theories and approaches into security. And Adam's already asking a question about jobs, and I think I posted that already.
Yes. I have one PhD student who graduated last December. He was hired by NATO for the cybersecurity. I have others. I have a person who is in Malaysia, and he is in charge of placement. So we want all our students to be placed. It's not 90%. We wanted the 100%. We have here entrepreneurs in Paris, the ones who came to France. Now we are all online. All our students are online. That's why we have a center in Malaysia for job search, and we are in contact with many companies to find jobs for the students or for the auditors when they are older. We can't call them students, we call them auditors. And so all students, once they register in Paris Graduate School, we give them a student number on the verification portal. And we have a QR code it's now fashion, the QR code, especially with this sanitary pass. We have the QR code everywhere, but we got it a long time ago on our degree as well.
Right.
Because we have the QR code with the student number, which means here the verification, nobody can, we have a good IT manager.
Yep.
And also all the programs will be on the portal, on the Moodle portal, and the students can check it whenever they want, or if they want to have a virtual classrooms, we have as well.
That's correct. Thank you. At this time, the MIS degree, as we call it, MISS, Masters in International Security Studies, is actually content from criminal justice and from international security studies. And what that is the field of security has widened so much over the last 25 years, moving from what we've seen, which is purely a tactical approach to handling counterterrorism. There is some academic approach, but issues in the environment like migration, systemic or state level understandings of society and the individual, which is human security, has caused us to look at how we view the academic curriculum these days. So with the latest NATO curriculum that has been developed by over 150 PhDs, we've incorporated the criminal justice program within that NATO curriculum. And it's so new that most people aren't even aware it's out there. And so with that, we've had first mover advantage in our master's degree, and that's going to culminate with the criminal justice diploma programs we have in different emphases. So not only in international security, but as we go along, there's other opportunities for advanced forensics, AML certifications, and we're actually going to work on a new master's in AML CTF. So with that, Dr. Akiki, thank you very much for joining us.
Pleasure.
So glad to be on board with you guys, and we look forward to talking real soon. And if you have any questions for myself or Dr. Akiki, you can find her at Paris Graduate School, IKI, or you can email us at.
I will put the website.
Yep. Thank you very much.
There is a question there, Todd. Did you see
Go
it?
ahead. Let's see.
By Adam.
Yes. So, becoming a regular police officer these days in the United States requires sometimes a bachelor's degree, and that's about $28,000 in most states. And so for the 99% of people that can't afford college, we are making college affordable within this field. The world suffers from counterterrorism so much. Countering violent extremism is the number one reason that I founded the GCTI. That was it, to stop the violent extremism that's going on that leads to terrorism. And so with that, with the curriculum and with our internships, these webinars, our seminar sessions, our diplomas and degrees, we're only growing because of the support of the community that we have. Our community is great. We have a great diversity and inclusion program and working group that Mr. Muhammad Omar oversees. We have our intern program that Stuart oversees, and we have a current regional coordinator program that Amber Oquindo, our coordinator program director. And what that is we offer students an opportunity to earn revenue. In exchange, they also get a discount on coursework. So recruiting is the same, just like at any campus, you get a discount for helping. But at the same time, we look for placement later. It's just not about us. It's about the student. So whether that's with the State Department or doing an internship with the Office of the Secretary of Defense, there's different places that we can help place students in additional positions. That's exactly what we do, whether it's with TSA, the FBI, the CIA. We're contingent upon how you want to grow as a student. So with that, thank you very much, Suha. It was a pleasure to have you, and we look forward to talking real soon in the future.
Pleasure is mine. Same here.
Thank you. Take care. And at this time, I'll turn it back over to Stuart. I think we have 3 more presentations, and I look forward to these. Thank you.
Danny, if you have a question, can you put it in the chat box? please, so we can, we'll just move forward with the webinar. I see you got your hand raised. Okay, so super duper. Welcome back to the speakers, and lovely to see you again, Suha. I hope you're well. Okay, so next up we have our lovely American Miss Madison Russo. She's a graduate from Emory University with a bachelor's degree in international studies, specializing in conflict and security, and a minor in Italian studies. She's currently pursuing a master's degree at the Elliott School of International Affairs of George Washington University in security policy studies, with a focus on transnational security involving threats posed by terrorists and criminal organizations across countries. Throughout her academic tenure, she has served as a researcher in several leadership positions. She has proficiency in Italian and is currently learning Arabic and Spanish. She has done research and written on topics ranging from economic matters pertaining to the Middle East and North Africa to the failures and successes of counterterrorism within the United States and Europe. As well as having written and researched several other topics, she is pursuing a career in counterterrorism and intelligence. So without further ado, I'm excited to hand the floor over to Miss Madison, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stuart, for that great introduction. So one second, let me just share my screen. It's so great to be able to speak with everyone today, by the way. And let's get started. All right. So I think I press share. Okay, perfect. So today I'll be speaking with you all about terrorism in a very serious and current issue today that warrants discussion and I believe is under-recognized and not talked about nearly enough. So for a quick overview, before we begin, I'm going to go over the definition of terrorism with everyone, at least the definition of terrorism that I have used in my paper, the current international landscape that we see today between Russia, China, and the United States, the historical use of terrorism by states, Russia and China's motives, followed by Russia and China's method of operations or MOs, and we'll also look at the future uses of terrorism in the interstate competition. So for a definition of terrorism, terrorism does not have one single definition that people can unanimously agree upon in the scholarly world. So the definition that I have adopted for my research is the following: the use of violence to create fear for political, religious, or ideological reasons against non-combatants in an effort to create an impact. This definition, the reason I'm using this definition is because it is the most universally accepted definition of terrorism there is. In a recent study, it was shown this, that a commonality, because there's a couple hundred definitions of terrorism that exist in scholarly literature. And this definition takes the main components that are the most common amongst these couple hundred definitions of terrorism and puts it all into one definition, what they all have in common. And so that's the reason why I'm using this definition in particular. Also keep in mind that it's not say that the violence has to be done by non-state actors, which is very interesting. So it could be by clandestine and the US Code's definition. So as for the current international landscape, so what we see right now in the world today is that China and Russia, the Chinese and Russian governments have grown increasingly more aggressive over the years. Some of these aggressive actions can be seen in the South China Sea with China, for instance, and with Russia in regards to Ukraine and the Czech Republic. So the competition, also, you can also see the aggressive actions in Taiwan, relevant to Taiwan with China. And that is something that we see almost daily on the news. Now, also, there's an intense competition going on between these three major powers right now. Russia, China, and the United States are all in an intensifying interstate competition involving the following categories relating to the economic sector, trying to compete with each other on a global scale. The Chinese government has been trying to replace the global currency of use, which is the US dollar. They've been trying to replace it with the Chinese currency and have been trying to compete with the US in terms of being a service economy very recently. They started, and this can be seen in their work plan that they have initiated and have been working towards, which means that they're trying to put more funds into their service economy to better compete against the United States. Russia and China both are competing militarily against the United States by trying to come up with more advanced weaponry. And it is something that we also are seeing on a daily basis, and that is quite worrisome for the state of affairs today. Culturally, China is trying to have a greater influence on the internet because they're trying to have a cultural impression on different countries and influence these different countries politically. Also, there's an unholy alliance between Russia and China. Both countries have similar strategic objectives, and both countries also have a mutual hatred for democracy. And so they formed this alliance in this competition to better compete against the United States and put it in a weaker position in the competition. So here on the map to the left, we can see the Russian forces on the Ukrainian border. You see the different military bases that Russia has made, the warships that Russia has put into place, and Russia has also supported militia groups within the Donbass region. And in this separatist control, a visual example of Russia's aggression taking place with Ukraine. And also, this is an example of China's aggression in the South China Sea on the right, because we see that China has been trying to increase the amount of aircraft they have in the South China Sea to better stage an attack potentially and serve their own purposes. So now we're going to go into the history of state-sponsored terrorism. So this is divided up into the 20th century and the 21st century for this presentation. So in the 20th century and World War I was one instance of, well, actually preceding World War I, the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand was an instance of state-sponsored terrorism. What's very interesting is that some Serbian officials and which was an anarchic group, and they had been training them militarily and in terrorist tactics. And one such person that was being trained by the Black Hand was Princip, I believe it was Princip, yes. So he had assassinated Archduke Ferdinand because he wanted to make an impact. He wanted to change what was going on. He wanted to get rid of the occupation of the territory that was his home. And also we see state-sponsored terrorism in the Cold War as well. The Cold War was the prime time for state-sponsored terrorism, and multiple socialist states had used it against the United States in the Cold War for a long period of time and against other Western countries to try and assert their influence and to hurt these other countries in the Cold War. Also, for the 21st century in Iran, so Iran is one of the most well-known state sponsors of terrorism in the 21st century. In the early 2000s, all the way up to today, they continue to sponsor, there's evidence that they continue to sponsor terrorist groups and support them. And what we see here on the right are the reasons found in a study for why different socialist states had sponsored terrorism against the United States. And these reasons include domestic security, diplomatic influence and recognition, intelligence gathering, and commercial interest. So let me explain these a little further. In domestic security, the socialist states would sponsor and support terrorist groups to preserve the security within their own borders. They would make a trade-off. They would say basically, we'll give you money, we will support you if you do not support attacks happening within our own territory or do not cause attacks happening within our own territory. So it was really a deal made between states and terrorist groups in the Cold War. Also, the states also got the benefit of supporting these groups that did not like the United States and other Western countries. In addition, the diplomatic influence and recognition that sponsoring and supporting terrorist groups could offer these groups, could offer these states, because the states would have greater influence in these other countries that the terrorist groups would operate in. In addition, there was intelligence gathering as another motive behind this. So in terms of intelligence gathering, the states would use these terrorist groups to gather intelligence on the ground where the terrorist groups were located, to determine if military installations were being put into place by the United States or by the United Kingdom. And so they would use these groups for intelligence, and it's a very cheap means of doing so, relatively. And they would also use them to protect their commercial interest, which is what China is seen doing today with the Taliban. So here you see a picture of the arrest of Prince Sip, who assassinated Archduke Ferdinand. This was shortly after he assassinated Archduke Ferdinand and his wife. So this is him being caught, and he was a young terrorist that was being supported by the In this picture, you see Iran's network of terror, really. And so you see that they give $1 billion to Hezbollah, $4 billion to the Assad regime, and all of this money to different groups like the Houthi rebels and the Shiite militias. And so you see them doing this, and it says Iran spends at least $7 billion, $7 billion per year on terrorism in the region. And that is a very, very large amount of money that they're spending on terrorism to sponsor it. So now let's get back to China and Russia, though. Why use it here and now? What good would it do to use terrorism today in this climate? Why would they do this? What benefit would they get? First, it would cause division within the United States. If they support, it would cause division in the US, as we can see with the different attacks that happened. So like after 9/11, for instance, and other Islamic extremist attacks that happened, there was a large divide that had been formed between the Muslim community and other religious groups, the Islamic community and other religious groups. And so there was this big divide that was formed, which actually had only kind of propagated more terrorist attacks by Muslims because they felt more alienated after these attacks because it was more divided after that time. In addition, you also see this more recently with Democrats and Republicans. We live in a very polarized time in the United States right now, and you see that there's this division in the US between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. For the BLM protests, for instance, and after the Capitol riot, it only worsened the divide between them mostly. And also, terrorism would serve as a distraction. It would draw the US's attention inwards as opposed to outwards, which is what China and Russia would want. because they do not want the US seeing what they're doing out in the world as much. They want their attention drawn increasingly inwards in the US rather than focused on their different movements in the international sphere. And this is one reason, for instance, why Russia consistently tries to play a spoiler role in the Middle East for the United States. They want to distract them from the area that they're trying to make strategic advances in. Also, it distracts the US government in terms of also resources being delegated instead to countering the competition. In addition, there are economic consequences to terrorism. While terrorism does not make up a large percentage of the GDP of the United States in terms of cost, it does have enormous cost. 9/11 alone, just directly, had hundreds of billions of dollars of economic damage. The Oklahoma City bombing had $600 or so million of economic damage. And this is not even including the war on terror that the US started after 9/11, or the different counterterrorism institutions, the cost of those to put in place after these attacks. And also, terrorist attacks in countries can decrease business ventures in those countries, people wanting to invest in them or do business there. It decreases that, and it can also hurt the supply chain. Public representation for China and Russia, the different governments. They would want to try and provoke a response, an aggressive response by the US government against its own civilians, because this could provide them with a way of trying to make a moral equivalency of what they do with their own citizens in their countries and what the US did in response to a terrorist attack, for instance, on its own citizens. They want to provoke a response so that they can, people see this on the international sphere and on the international stage, people see this, and China and Russia use this as a way of saying, see, the US government does exactly what we do. We're not so bad after all. And they also would probably want the US to come up with more authoritarian policies, perhaps, so that it gives more credence to the lack of deterrence that the US has right now against Russia and China. Sorry about that. So the lack of deterrence in that the two liabilities, there's a military liability in terms of military reprisals when sponsoring a terrorist group. So typically this would be a hindrance on countries supporting terrorist groups. But the thing is that in order for deterrence to really work, it has to be credible. And if the US would not credibly attack China or Russia after sponsoring terrorist attacks, then that won't really act as a deterrence for them to not sponsor them. So there's this lack of deterrence there. And also, would probably be economic sanctions by the United States on China and Russia. But even then, the efficacy of economic sanctions is very iffy, and people do not agree on the efficacy of it at all, and it's still unknown. And here's a quote by Abraham Lincoln in 1858, but is still just as relevant today in terms of division in the United States that terrorist attacks could cause. A house divided against itself cannot stand. This would mean that terrorist attacks within the United States would cause a great division between different groups and would lead to a lack of progress and would just hinder the United States in the interstate competition ultimately. So now for the method of operation, or the MO, of both the Chinese and Russian governments. So China has supported in the past the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and Russia has supported Hezbollah and Taliban in the past. So both countries have groups. In addition, both countries have no qualms about targeting non-combatants because you can see this in that they actually target their own civilians even, and so their own citizens. And so you see this all the time with their human rights violations in their own countries. They target their own citizens quite often who are dissidents. And this just is one indication that they really have less qualms, less worries about targeting non-combatants than other countries may, such as the United States, perhaps. Also, the seeds of terror in 2020, this is what some people called them, this whole phenomenon in 2020, where there were mysterious seeds that were showing up on people's doorsteps in Western countries only. And these seeds were all shipped from China. And if it said bought from Taiwan to go to other Western countries also. And so the interesting thing, though, is these seeds of terror potentially were actually being used to hurt agriculture in the Western countries, as well as hurt the supply chain in these countries. And officials warned people against planting these seeds for that reason. In addition, China has sent students and professors to the United States in the past for espionage. Now, students and professors, these are non-state actors. And so they use these non-state actors for espionage purposes in American universities. And what's very worrisome for the United States is that the most international students we have in the United States are from China. And that just increases the possibility of espionage we have here in the US, as well as the professors using their positions in universities to still research and commit espionage. Also, you see this with hacking groups, the method of operation in terms of Russia, for instance. There are different hacking groups that have hacked into government infrastructure and different government agencies, and these groups have been linked to the Russian government. And you see that this hacking is taking place, and they're using these non-state actors, these criminal organizations, to help their own cause. In addition, you see they're influencing on social media. Both China and Russia have used AI to better influence on social media and provoke people into action. They have done this on both sides of the aisle and for all different movements and different groups. And they provoke it no matter whether it is a more Republican cause, a Democratic cause, or racial, religious. They do it for all counts and on all fronts to divide the US. And Russia has routinely used militia groups in the past and has sponsored them. One famous incident of this is the militia groups that are in the Donbass region during the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. And Russia had used these groups to basically do their bidding and further their own strategic objectives of getting this territory. In addition, there was intelligence produced with a moderate level of confidence that the Russian government had been paying members of the American soldiers. And so this is one instance, also another instance potentially of Russia using non-state actors for their own means. So it really fits the method of operation for them to sponsor terrorism against the United States. So now we'll go into the potential future uses of terrorism, because this is what really matters. So the most likely forms of terrorism that will happen in the future are covert sponsorship of terrorism and cyber terrorism. Because covert sponsorship of terrorism, cyber terrorism would come with less risk than other types of terrorism. in which they use their own agents, for instance, in the US. As well as there are also implications with both of the countries' friendly relations with the Taliban that have been very current today. The United States. And so these implications are that these countries have friendly relations with the Taliban, so they can actually purchase, though, the weapons, the American weaponry and American systems that were left behind in Afghanistan during the rapid withdrawal. They can purchase those from the Taliban now, which would only better their own militaries. And these friendly relations may be a way of cozying up to do just that and increase their geopolitical footprints in the Middle East and Africa, as well as the targets for the future uses of terrorism. What is very interesting is that these targets are less widely publicized than the targets that we typically see in terrorism, with terrorist incidents today. In terms of most terrorist incidents seem to be in the entertainment sector a lot of times, for instance, with different groups. And you see this mostly publicized by the media. They always publicize ones on the entertainment sector. But in the future, these targets will mostly comprise the government sector, the military sector, the banking sector, business sector, medical sector, and energy sector. And why these sectors? Because these sectors would have the largest impact on the United States in the interstate competition. And this would have the most impact on them. Now, just for a key point recap, there are increased tensions going on, and people are very worried that this will lead to a physical conflict between the United States and China and Russia. And so there are increased tensions right now in the world, and terrorism can be very beneficial in this competition for the reasons that were stated in the presentation. And terrorism matches China and Russia's MOs, their method of operations. It matches that, so it would match their profiles more so. Contemporary terrorism that we see today publicized in the media, for instance. Any questions?
Amazing. Absolutely amazing. I've really enjoyed these presentations today. Fantastic.
I have too. I've really enjoyed seeing everyone's.
I'll just bring
Very
the
educational.
up. Yeah, absolutely agree, Adam. Very well spoken. Does anybody have any questions for Miss Madison? Can you stop sharing your screen, please, Miss Madison?
Yes, no worries.
That's better. I can see you better now. Yeah, the floor is open. If anybody wants to raise their hand. Super interesting area, the interstate competition. Something I'm not too versed in, especially with the China aggression. So yeah, absolutely fantastic.
I appreciate that.
Hi everyone, my name's Taylor and I'm one of the interns at the Global Counterterrorism Institute, and I'll be speaking at the webinar today. Firstly, I'd like to apologise for not being there in person, but I've tried my best to compress my research into around a 15-minute video presentation, and I will put my email address at the end of my PowerPoint slides in case you have any follow-up questions or any advice that you'd like to give me or anything you want to follow up on. So I thought I'd start by giving you a little bit of a background, an introduction to myself. So as I said, my name's Taylor. I'm currently living in London. I graduated from University College London last summer in the middle of the pandemic with a first-class honours degree in security and crime science. The degree was very multidisciplinary. I did a lot of things, so looking from social science to coding and programming, and I focused my dissertation on the effectiveness of the UK intelligence services in the post-9/11 period. I since started my master's degree at King's College London in Intelligence and International Security last September, where I've been focusing largely on the Middle East and counter-terrorism, and I'm in the process of completing my master's thesis looking at Al-Qaeda's strategic evolution, focusing specifically on Mali. which is closely linked to my research today. I wanted to expand on my dissertation, so I had a good amount of knowledge on the topic. During my academic studies, I've also partaken in some internships, so I've worked with Magistrates, Courts and Tribunal Services. I've worked as a social researcher for the Cambridgeshire Constabulary and with a private technology company, and now I'm here with the Global Counterterrorism Institute, and I hope you really enjoy my presentation, so I'll go forward to the slides. I'd like to begin my presentation by highlighting a gap in the research. Since 9/11, a vast amount of research has been dedicated to the exploration of the failures of the war on terror, from the perspective of the US-led coalition to inform future counterterrorism policy and strategy. Despite terrorist organisations demonstrating clear capabilities of learning, less attention has been paid to explore their failures and lessons learned, and the implications that this may have for the evolution of their policies and strategies. Therefore, this research will explore al-Qaeda's failures and lessons learned in Afghanistan after the 2001 US-led invasion, and in Iraq after the 2003 US-led invasion, focusing specifically on their strategic evolution when compared to the experiences of their affiliates during the later insurgencies in Yemen, Somalia, and Mali. Historically, terrorists' inabilities to internalise lessons from historic mistakes have been highlighted within the relevant literature, intensified in the case of jihadi organisations due to their perceived deep-rooted ideological inflexibility which underpins their strategies and worldviews. This ideological rigidness forms an obstacle to the greater flexibility, innovation, and fundamental shift in modus operandi, structure, and goals required for strategic evolution, helping to explain why at the tactical level, al-Qaeda has seen success but often failed at the strategic level. However, terrorists' inabilities to learn are not the consensus in the relevant literature. Ferslen, Byrne and Gorzig, for example, contest that jihadi groups, looking at al-Qaeda in particular, are capable of change, suggesting that it is in fact their ability to learn cumulatively from their operational past which has preserved their longevity for almost 2 decades. Their learning transformed them into a dynamic and flexible organisation, allowing them to achieve tactical goals while simultaneously maintaining the pursuit of their long-term strategy, the establishment of an Islamic State. Conceivably, al-Qaeda have developed a lose and learn doctrine, in which they recognise their losses and demonstrate a willingness to adapt and employ these lessons to inform future operations. Suggestively, learning occurs when terrorist organisations think beyond their immediate survival and instill a culture of learning to ensure that ideas outlast individuals. This has been particularly important for al-Qaeda, having faced the US's decapitation strategy, which saw 75% of their original leadership killed by 2011. Like any organisation, al-Qaeda has learnt from their own experiences, but also from that of others. For instance, Gorzig argues that al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb learnt tactically from al-Qaeda, but strategically from counter-terrorism efforts. Although, drawing on the notion that terrorists' learning is often a result of self-reflection from previous engagements in violence, in which the old is synthesized with the new in a trial and error type of internal evolution, relative to the scope, this research will focus specifically on al-Qaeda and its affiliates learning from each other and self-learning. To further operationalization, commensurate with Crenshaw's differentiation between learning type, this research will focus specifically on strategic learning for a more focused exploration, defined as significant points of novelty which influence a change in the organization's shaping of their goals and how they relate their tactics and operations to these new objectives. In looking more specifically, immediately after the 9/11 attacks, the US launched Operation Enduring Freedom, targeting al-Qaeda and their ally, the Taliban, in Afghanistan. Under the Taliban, al-Qaeda enjoyed a fertile breeding ground and a safe haven. However, by the end of 2002, the Taliban had lost vast amounts of territory and support from local Afghans due to their draconian-style governance, crackdown on poppy cultivation, and fundamentalist implementation of Islamic law. despite their political program originally promoting positive improvements to entice the local population. Of particular importance to al-Qaeda's early defeat was the betrayal of local tribesmen. Pakistani and Afghan tribes turned a number of insurgents over to the US as al-Qaeda failed to build relationships with them, and the Taliban restricted their participation in government and violated their tribal norms, which led to an inability to mobilize the population. Demonstrating al-Qaeda's willingness to learn from their mistakes was an intercepted letter to Abu Musab Zarqawi from Ayman al-Zawahi, al-Qaeda's second-in-command, offering a sophisticated analysis of the strategic takeaways from Afghanistan and the new goals for Iraq. The letter emphasized the importance of engaging tribal communities and gaining at least the limited support of the local population. Zawahi also warns against making the same mistakes in Iraq, recognizing the Taliban's Pashto particularism as an obstacle to securing the support of the local population and the risk of the same fate in Iraq due to the Shia majority. Conceivably, these lessons demonstrate al-Qaeda's newfound recognition of the importance of the local population and accommodating the host environment during a local insurgency. After the invasion of Afghanistan, the US shifted their attention to ousting Saddam Hussein and regime change in Iraq, launching Operation Iraqi Freedom in March 2003. Al-Qaeda's pursuit of Iraq is recognized as their biggest disaster, which damaged their reputation and laid the foundations for the birth of their biggest rival, the Islamic State of Iraq. Although Iraq influenced the greatest development in the global jihadi movement since the Soviets' withdrawal from Afghanistan, provoking new strategic thinking across its affiliate branches. Initially, al-Qaeda in Iraq's pursuit of Iraq was promising. The al-Qaeda branch sought to capitalize on the Islamist-leaning Sunni nationalists' revolt against desunnifying Iraq and their goals to end political disenfranchisement and oust foreign intervention. However, al-Qaeda in Iraq squandered this unique opportunity to build a safe haven and an Islamic State in the heart of the Islamic world through strategic miscalculations. Despite al-Qaeda's attempts to warn Zarqawi about the armed Islamic group of Algeria's failed insurgency in Algeria, al-Qaeda in Iraq's failures have been likened to that exact experience in which their enemy did not defeat them, but rather they defeated themselves. Overall, al-Qaeda in Iraq's defeat was due to their overly ambitious strategy, resulting in the pursuit of unrealistic ends through inappropriate ways using inadequate means, which was underpinned by their attempt to implement a revolutionary and global cause into a local nationalist Sunni tribal movement. Ultimately, al-Qaeda in Iraq's zealotry strategy led to their failure to win the hearts and minds of the Iraqi population. Simultaneously, al-Qaeda in Iraq's strategy became progressively more extreme and discredited, and the Sunni community came to resent their barbarity, harboring the belief that they were trying to liberate Iraq from Iraqis, not from foreign invaders. In particular, al-Qaeda in Iraq appeared to mimic the Taliban's ideological inflexibility. For instance, they banned music and satellite dishes, punished people for speaking French, and even killed women that refused to wear all black and the hijab. The Iraqi population took a particular dislike to al-Qaeda in Iraq's use of suicide attacks and civilian murders, which included the targeting of fellow Muslims. Contradictory to the customs of the Iraqi Sunnis that they were seeking to govern, in the areas that they seized, al-Qaeda in Iraq also imposed a strict form of Sharia using terror tactics, which further alienated supporters of the wider Sunni movement. Additionally, like al-Qaeda and the Taliban in Afghanistan, al-Qaeda in Iraq failed to build a relationship with local tribes. They violated tribal norms regarding marriage, encroached on their economic interests, forced puritanical fundamentalism upon them, alienated and even murdered individuals that failed to support them. Anti-al-Qaeda sentiment was only worsened by al-Qaeda in Iraq's brutal terror campaign and instigation of a sectarian war, accompanied by their inadequate means to protect Sunni communities from Shia retaliatory violence, which saw them ultimately undermined by the Iraqi population, tribes, and fellow Sunni rebels that had initially welcomed them. Furthermore, despite warnings, al-Qaeda in Iraq emulated the GIA's mistake of turning against its fellow rebels in an attempt to monopolize power, based on an overestimation of their power and the flawed assumed passivity of local insurgents, despite being largely outnumbered by and militarily weaker than the Shiites, Sunnis, and coalition forces. Al-Qaeda in Iraq's infighting also undermined its claims to be a global vanguard of Islam on behalf of all Muslims, damaging the brand's reputation, as well as highlighting the tendency for jihadists to alienate the host communities of the local insurgencies which they seek to hijack. This is also evidenced in their over-reliance on foreign fighters with foreign ideas. In particular, it was their declaration of the Islamic State of Iraq in 2006 which sealed their fate, as they claimed monopoly over political leadership but lacked the drive and ability to govern. This strategic error can be categorized as a situational miscalculation, referring to strategic overreach which leads to mistakes regarding intermediate aims and tactics. These strategic miscalculations were detrimental to Al-Qaeda in Iraq's failure and laid the foundations for the US's surge in 2007, facilitated by the Awakening movement, which saw Sunnis partnered with the US to fight Al-Qaeda in Iraq, including the Anbar Awakening and the Awakening Councils, also known as the Sons of Iraq program. Given the similarities between Al-Qaeda in Iraq's failures and those of previous conflicts, Hafez uses this case study to contest Al-Qaeda's capabilities to learn. However, it must also be noted that the wider Al-Qaeda movement criticised Al-Qaeda in Iraq's handling of Iraq. In particular, bin Laden criticised infighting, and Zawahi condemned Zarqawi's indiscriminate Shia killings, use of foreign fighters, and the extremity of their terror campaign. This may suggest that Al-Qaeda in Iraq's failures were not necessarily a testament to jihadists' abilities to learn, but instead to Zarqawi's fanaticism and extremism at the individual level, for Al-Qaeda in Iraq's strategy is said to be largely based on his personality. Upon reflection, this presentation has explored the literature surrounding terrorists' learning capabilities before outlining the failures and lessons learned during Al-Qaeda's insurgencies in Afghanistan and Iraq after 9/11. In assessing Al-Qaeda's long-term learning capabilities by fast-forwarding to their affiliates and branches insurgencies in Yemen, Somalia, and Mali, by Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Al-Shabaab, and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb retrospectively, it can be concluded that while Al-Qaeda appear to recognise their historic failures and can outline lessons for their next theatre, they seem to fail in the implementation stage. Arguably, this is due to a governance dilemma in which Al-Qaeda continue to struggle to balance their post-9/11 strategic learning, which typically encourages a Western-inspired hearts and minds style approach, characterized by a more moderate form of Islam and legitimate governance to achieve their strategic aim of establishing an alternative Islamic state and the imposition of a harsh Islamist rule, and over-reliance on violence and extremity, underpinned by the ideological rigidness inherent to jihadi organizations, which ultimately led the Al-Qaeda insurgencies preceding Afghanistan and Iraq down the same route to defeat as their predecessors. Here are some of the sources that I used for this research. I really hope you enjoyed my presentation, and I have provided my LinkedIn handle and my email address below in case you wanted to follow up on anything. Thank you again for listening, and thank you to the Global Counterterrorism Institute for the opportunity. I hope you enjoy the rest of the webinar.
I will begin my presentation by giving a brief overview of the patterns that have emerged in terror attacks over the last 6 years in the USA, and a variety of statistics to accompany this overview. I will then proceed to discuss the general allocation of counter-terrorism resources in the United States, alongside the number of attacks that these threats have each committed within the borders, which allows for a brief overlook at the proportionality of the allocation of counter-terrorism resources. In the following slide, I will consider some of the factors that have contributed to the rise of right extremism and to the rising number of white extremist terror attacks. To conclude my presentation, I will debate whether the rise of white extremist terror attacks and the poor allocation of the country's counterterrorism resources is likely to change. While many wrongly associate terrorism with Islam, the terror threat is evolving, and new groups have grown into deadly machines ready to strike. Many of the more prominent groups that pose a threat to the Western nations currently are white extremist groups, such as the now infamous Proud Boys. Often, the actors that commit these acts of terror, be they lone actors or coordinated groups of terrorists, do so under the banner of white extremist terror groups, but they're not often classified as terrorists. The issue came to a boiling point recently with the attack on the US Capitol building, where thousands of white extremists, claiming they were inspired by President Trump, rioted and broke into the Capitol building, beating a Capitol police officer to death. Scholars such as Tucker and Abdullah were already debating the difference between how jihadi terrorists and white extremist terrorists became classified as terrorists after an attack. This attack on the Capitol building propelled the issue to the forefront of international attention. For the purpose of this presentation, the term white extremist terrorists, is an encompassing term that will be used to refer to white supremacists, neo-Nazis, Nazi sympathisers, and white nationalists. This is due to the fact that there is much overlap between the ideologies of the groups. A terrorist may be a member of every group mentioned before, and thus it becomes incredibly difficult to separate them. Jihadi extremists is a term that refers to the people who've been radicalised to wage jihad, the holy war, claiming that their actions are justified by Islam. I'm using the term jihadi extremists or jihadi extremist terrorists rather than Islamic terrorists, as while it is a phrase that's been commonly coined by the public, the media, and prominent scholars alike, the latter is a term that's been used to perpetuate racist stereotypes. As members of the public, the majority of us are exposed to Western media on a daily basis. We are often consistently bombarded with stories and images of terror attacks occurring worldwide, as well as closer to home in the Western Hemisphere. Yet despite the fact that we regularly see the news of terror attacks occurring, since 2015, the overall number of successful terror attacks on US soil has fallen. The 2019 Global Terrorism Index stated that there's also been a fall in the number of fatalities that have occurred in terror-related incidences. Despite the overall fall in the number of terror attacks that have occurred within US borders, there's actually been an increase in the number of terror attacks perpetrated by white extremist terrorists. In fact, the number of attacks committed by white extremist terrorists quadrupled between 2016 to 2017. The Global Terrorism Index published that there's been a fall of 15% in the number of fatalities caused by all forms of terrorism. However, that does not include the number of fatalities caused by white extremist-related terror groups, which, in contrast, rose by 709% between the years of 2014 to 2019. On the right-hand side of the slide, I've included a graph that illustrates the number of terror attacks and unsuccessful plots on US soil organised by their perpetrators' orientation. According to the graph published by the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, jihadist terrorists committed the least attacks of the three listed threats. Violent far-right terrorists committed by far the highest number of attacks, and the violent far-left terrorists committed 3 times more attacks than jihadi terrorists, but way less than the violent far-right extremists. As you can see, between January and August of 2020, the number of attacks or plots organised by jihadi terrorists is only 4, whereas the violent far-right, which in this presentation I refer to as white extremist terrorists, committed over 10 times the number of attacks or plots within the same time period. While the overall number of terror attacks has fallen, the number of victims created by terror attacks has actually risen, and the government of the last 2 decades have allocated the blame for this trend to jihadi terrorism, or occasionally to Antifa and the far left. Since the inauguration of Donald Trump in 2017, the USA has seen 4 times less people killed in jihadi terror attacks than there has been in white extremist terror attacks, where 43 people have been killed. The 9/11 attacks pushed American foreign policy to centre around combating the jihadi terror threat and the war on terror, although perhaps the war on terror should have been more specific in title, as war on jihadi terror may have been more accurate. Since the September 11th attacks, American counterterrorism resources and investigations have continued in this vein, allocating the majority of its counterterrorism resources to jihadi terrorism. In the FBI, between the years of 2005 to 2009, only 19% of counterterrorism agents were assigned to domestic terror investigations, with the majority of these agents primarily focusing on counterterrorism. This unequal allocation of resources continued through the Obama administration and even grew during the Trump administration, with the closure of government bursaries and schemes that aim to educate on the issues of white extremist terror. The closure of programs will be looked at further in the next slide. Why has this pattern emerged? Well, there are many factors that over time have led to the fall of jihadi terrorism and to the rise of white extremist terrorism, as well as to the unproportionate allocation of counter-terrorism resources with their respective threats. One of these factors is the matter of race relations in the USA. People who are perceived to be Muslim are subjected to deeper scrutiny than their white counterparts. Since 2001, media outlets such as the newspaper The Sun and other Western media outlets such as movies, such as Spooks the Greater Good, to name one, have portrayed the stereotypical terrorist to be of Muslim faith, usually from the Middle East, the Arab region, with brown skin. Since its creation, the United States has had a majority white Christian population. In a majority white country such as the USA, Muslims and people from the Middle East are in the minority, and as such they lay outside of the social norm. Because of this, they present an automatic threat to the order of the system. The focus of a nation, a society, is maintaining their power. This comes by maintaining the status quo and by getting rid of any outside or indeed inside things, people, any ideas that could present a change. Change is not favoured by the powers that be, as it poses an unknown threat to their current dominance or power. Power dynamics in the international system squash any attempt to change, and these dynamics are replayed on a smaller scale within individual societies or countries. This power dynamic in the USA became exaggerated post 9/11, when jihadi terrorists proved that they provided a larger threat to civilians and to greater society. This one event reinforced racist stereotypes of Arab men, which have lasted until this very day. The idea of the stereotypical Muslim is based on the outdated racist idea that all Muslims look a certain way. Stereotypes such as Muslim men have long beards, or that all Muslim women wear a hijab, or that all people who are Arab or of Southern or West Asian descent are all Muslims. In the USA, white people are treated with lower levels of suspicion from law enforcement officials than black people or Arab people are, and they're subjected to less routine surveillance. This is demonstrated through policies such as the controversial stop and frisk tactic that is employed by the American NYPD, or was employed, shall I say, which has resulted in more African Americans and Latinos being stopped and frisked than any other ethnicity. Have these racist views influenced the rising rates with which white extremists motivated terror attacks are occurring? Well, white extremists have flown under the radar since the days of the KKK. The government, media, and the public have all at times either denied their existence or have simply ignored them. White extremism has peaked over the years in response to certain political events, such as the election of the first black president, Barack Obama, to the office. But until 2017 to 2018, it was a relatively underestimated threat that was not commonly talked about, let alone dealt with. Attacks perpetrated by white extremist terrorists more than quadrupled between 2016 to 2017. African American churches, synagogues, and indeed outdoor social venues have all been subjected to horrendous tragedies, all tied together by one common denominator: a white extremist who decided to take the lives of innocent people in a terrorist attack. Another factor that's influenced both the rise of white extremism and the allocation of counter-terrorism resources is the 9/11 attacks and the age of jihadi terrorism. The most deadly terror attack on the US soil since Pearl Harbor, the September 11th attack, shocked the world, undoubtedly. Images of people jumping from burning towers were shown instantly across social media platforms and the news. They were constantly shown on the news channels worldwide, horrifying everyone. The attack became the founding reason for the launch of the War on Terror, a campaign that refocused US counterterrorism resources almost exclusively around jihadi terrorism. There was also a significant increase in the number of Islamophobic attacks and general anti-Islam rhetoric in the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 hijackings. Language used by the government of the USA to describe and address these threats has been different also. Language has, for a very long time, been securitized, so that the public, in this presentation the public of the USA, aligns itself with the views of the government regarding certain issues. Issues such as the war on terror or the invasion of Afghanistan. In terms of jihadi terrorism, the theory of securitization can be applied to the group Daesh, ISIL. Immediately post 9/11, jihadi terrorism was presented as a threat to both individual security and to state security across the majority of Western states, but especially in the USA and the UK. They presented the idea of Western life and its values, such as freedom and individual liberty, that these values were under threat from jihadi terrorists who sought to take away the freedoms that the USA both provides and protects. In comparison, white extremist terrorism is treated in a very different manner. In the past decade, it was rarely talked about at all, but when it was briefly acknowledged, the language used was not emotive. It did not securitize the threat as an actual threat, and thus white extremist activity wasn't considered a threat until recent years. As well as this, white extremist terrorism is not always automatically considered to be terrorism. Often, the classification of an attack perpetrated by a white extremist is not classified as terrorism for political or personal reasons. Media outlets such as Fox News depicts many of the men who commit such attacks as mentally ill or lonely or sick. These words elicit a certain amount of sympathy from watchers. This gentle way of talking about white extremist terrorists lowers the level of alarm that the public feels and the level of threat that these men present. In contrast, suspected jihadi terrorists are automatically labelled as a terrorist, regardless of their status as guilty or innocent of the attack. They are also presented by the government and discussed by the media as savages or inhumane. All of these words have been used by media outlets in the past. These words immediately securitize them into a threat, and these words legitimize harsher punishments and treatments to detain jihadi terrorists. Usually, the terms extremist and extremism are used in connection to jihadi terrorists, or have been in the past. The term extremism does not have the same meaning or connotations today that it had 50 years ago. The term extremism became commonly used by both the government and the media in reference to jihadi terrorists. This was done in an attempt to lessen the negative reactions to the West's heavily militarized response when the war on terror was declared. The word extremism possesses negative connotations, as society considers extremes to be inappropriate and unbalanced. By associating the word extremism with negative outcomes, the powers of the West were arguably attempting to highlight the destructive, harmful nature of their enemy, while attempting to repair their own reputation. As well as the aforementioned factors, the election of Mr. Donald Trump to the position of President of the United States has, at least partially, contributed to the rise of the domestic white extremist terror threat. The Trump administration has focused government counterterrorism resources almost solely on countering the threat of jihadi terrorism. His administration reduced or entirely closed down programs designed to combat the white extremist terror threat, as well as closing down programs aimed at preventing radicalization of people in white extremist groups. The Department of Homeland Security had previously given multiple grants to programs such as Life After Hate. The Life After Hate program was one of the only programs in the US that aimed to aid people who wanted to leave white extremist groups. As well as there was a grant to a group of university researchers who were developing a program that helped prevent young people from becoming involved with violent white supremacist ideologies. Unfortunately, the Trump administration quickly cancelled both of these grants and did not request funding for any other grants in this area. As well as this, the newly named Office of Terrorism Prevention Partnerships had its number of staff cut by half to only 8 employees and had its budget cut by 85% of its previous budget, left with only $3 million. Not only has his administration acted to cut funding, but President Trump himself has had an unfortunate history with discussing white extremist groups. It was debated by many people after his recent presidential debate whether he was deliberately ignoring these groups and the threat they pose to the US, choosing not to comment, or whether he was actively encouraging them, as the representative of New York, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, suggested on her personal Twitter after the debate. In the presidential debate, Donald Trump refused to condemn violent white extremist groups, instead saying that extremist groups such as the Proud Boys need to stand back and stand by, then proceeding to state that somebody had to do something about the left and Antifa. The Proud Boys are classified by the Southern Poverty Law Center as a hate group, and are classified as an extremist group that promotes an Islamophobic, anti-immigrant ideology. Immediately after his comments were aired, the Proud Boys group that he referred to in the debate were posting proudly across social media that they had the president's backing, and suggesting that they were ready to stand by, as he'd suggested in the debate. His comments at the presidential debate were not the only comments that he's made in regards to white extremist groups in the past. In the wake of the fatal Unite the Right white extremist protest in Charlottesville in 2017, President Trump suggested that there were fine people on both sides. My apologies. While a comment seemingly neutral in its political position, many members of the public, as well as many Democratic politicians, criticised his phrasing, suggesting that he should have spoken negatively about a protest and those responsible for killing a counter-protester and injuring over 30 other counter-protesters. President Trump's refusal to condemn such white extremist groups and his administration's cutting of funding aimed at countering the violent white extremist threat, namely to preventative programs, the history of race in the USA, and the jihadi terrorist attacks of 9/11 have all allowed the threat of white extremist terror to grow within the borders of the US. Is this period of white extremist groups growing stronger at an end in the USA? This slide will analyse both sides of the previous question, and I will debate whether the election of Joe Biden to the office of president will be likely to have an effect on the treatment of the threat of white extremist terror, and on the allocation of the US government's counter-terrorism resources. The election of Joe Biden to the office of President of the United States has raised questions about whether this established status quo of how the terrorist threat is treated will remain the same, or if the US government will reconsider their position, instead paying more attention to the growing threat of white extremist terror. Previous efforts to counter the domestic terror threat has been hampered by Republican politicians, as it's been stated during previous attempts, that most initiatives aimed at combating domestic terrorists equal the persecution of conservatives. Within 6 months of taking office, President Biden revealed a new priority for the US government, which was accepted due to its technicalities, as the strategy that he developed was being heavily encouraged, but was not technically written into law. This decision was reported to have been made due to the need for immediate action, whereas any attempt to introduce new law would probably not pass in today's contentious political climate. Through his new 32-page published strategy to fight domestic terrorism, President Biden stated that his new strategy was to build on resources and intelligence agencies already in place in the USA, to target the white extremist terror threat under the name of racially motivated or anti-government extremism. The focus in the new fight against domestic terrorism is first prevention. This is as well as encouraging the sharing of domestic terror-related information between intelligence agencies in the USA, which has historically been an issue and has hampered counter-terrorism investigations in the past. While the response of the government and their agencies is beginning to change, now taking a more proactive route to combat the threat of white extremism, there are still inequalities and uncertainty. As well, there are clear laws allowing for the prosecution of jihadi terrorists and international terrorists, There are no statutes that currently discuss how domestic terrorists can be prosecuted, and Biden's new strategy did not address this. With this inequality in law, the two terror threats cannot be prosecuted in the same manner. Due to the lack of legislation, the number of prosecutions of white extremist terrorists, will remain lower until there is a law that can deal with this, as the clear laws do with jihadi terrorism. As demonstrated by the previous issue, the majority of the resources are still diverted towards the global war on terrorism, leaving the agencies that are responsible for combating the home threat that is white extremism and terrorism still underfunded and undermanned. On the next slide is a list of references that I've shown in text when referencing a statistic, in case that you'd like to delve further into the sources that I've used for your own work. Thank you very much for your time today. If you've been left with any questions or points you wish to discuss, please contact me. I can be contacted through LinkedIn, and my link to the profile is showing on the screen. Thank you.